281. The first day of the new school year ends. The dueling class passed quickly and enjoyably. Professor Black handed out house points generously for good performances, and Scott earned the highest mark, 10 points. Overall, the professor's first lesson had been a clear success. Scott's good mood, however, didn't last. After dinner, he ran into the potions master in a corridor. "Good evening, Professor Snape," Scott said, offering the greeting first. Snape stopped and repeated Scott's earlier comment from Defense Against the Dark Arts with that cutting, rhetorical tone of his. Dumbledore finally made the right choice? His voice had a way of putting people on edge. Scott resisted the urge to roll his eyes. He knew Snape had long wanted the Dada job, and that any new professor in the position would draw his ire, especially if that professor was black. Old grievances stacked on old grudges. Still, Scott didn't want to be dragged into their feud. "Is that your assessment of Black, Mr. Trollope?" Snape pressed. "I must say, the insight of the great Mr. Trollope is disappointing." Snape's dark, impassive stare felt like a weight. Scott hesitated, not wanting to offend the potions master, but also unable to contradict his earlier praise of Black. "I did say it, Professor," Scott replied carefully. "The previous professors weren't very effective. Professor Black is at least far more competent than Quirrell or Lockhart." "Humph," Snape scoffed. "Compared to those two idiots, even your nauseating flattery of Black begins to make sense." He flicked his robes and walked away, chin raised. When Snape's back disappeared around the corner, Scott let out a long breath. He decided then to be more careful. He had no intention of getting caught in the crossfire between Snape and Black. He was a Ravenclaw, not cannon fodder for a Slytherin Gryffindor dispute. If anyone had to play the mediator between those two, let Savior Harry shoulder it. Scott returned to the common room and set about finishing the day's essay in the house library. Halfway through, Jacob found him. "What's up?" Jacob asked, leaning against a bookshelf while Scott kept writing. "Ever since Lockhart, people know not to idolize reputations," Jacob said. "So what's your real opinion of Professor Black?" Scott didn't look up. "I think most people in Ravenclaw have already talked about it," he said. "Give me an objective evaluation," Jacob pressed. "Come on." Scott set his quill down and thought a moment. "He has a lot of practical experience and solid theoretical knowledge," he said. "His weaknesses are emotional volatility and a lack of teaching experience. In short, he's competent for the role." Jacob nodded, satisfied, thanked him, and left. Scott returned to his essay, but before long, Savannah approached, awkward and hesitant. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "about my brother." Scott looked up, surprised. "You found him?" Savannah shook her head a little, looking uncertain. "We found him, but he won't wake up." Scott felt a flicker of recognition. He hadn't worked out Aaron's exact whereabouts before, only his condition. He remembered the conclusion of his calculations. Aaron was alive, his body in a deep sleep, consciousness half awake, while his spirit seemed unusually active. It might be a strange charm, or something tied to the druid magic in Savannah's family, though he knew little of druids. He straightened his notes and asked, "Is he fully awake at all?" "We can't wake him yet," she said, refusing to go into details. After thanking him again, she left. Scott watched her go and recalled with renewed interest the way Savannah had transformed into a wolf. Druidic beast transformation, he thought, sounded far more flexible than becoming an animagus, which usually meant one fixed animal. He made a mental note to ask the Ravenclaw mentor about it on Saturday. That night in the dormitory, Roger muttered under his breath, "All through class today, I felt Caccini staring at me." "Even in the Great Hall?" Eddie asked with a grin. "Sounds like she still has a soft spot, like Miss Mill." Scott, listening from his bed with a book in hand, felt his stomach drop at Roger's words. He remembered the humiliating incident over the summer when he disguised himself as Roger and Caccini had cornered him in Diagon Alley. He stayed quiet as Roger went on. "It's weird," Roger said. "A whole summer has passed. I thought a break would have eased things, but now it seems worse." "You saying she hates you more?" Eddie asked, enjoying Roger's discomfort. Milton suggested, "Why don't you just talk to her?" Roger hesitated. "Maybe I should, but I don't know if I can handle how she looks at me." Scott wanted to stop him, to tell him not to bring it up, but he held his tongue. Advising friends about their relationships was not his habit, and besides, he couldn't reveal the truth. He'd returned secretly to Britain over the summer and done things he couldn't explain. Keeping that trip secret was necessary for safety. He wouldn't risk unraveling it now. So he turned a page and listened while his friends worried through their own problems, letting this one remain unsolved. I can't believe what I missed yesterday. At breakfast on Friday, Eddie hurried over to sit next to Scott and snatched a piece of bread. You probably haven't heard yet. He beamed like someone with the juiciest gossip. Scott, Roger, and Milton looked up as he tore off a chunk, shoved it in his mouth, chewed a few times, and swallowed. He couldn't wait to tell them. Professor Black's Defense Against the Dark Arts class got off to a good start yesterday afternoon, but Hagrid's first care of magical creatures went to pieces. Yesterday? When did Hagrid teach? Scott asked. 3rd year, Eddie said. He brought in some terrifying beast and it ended up injuring Malfoy. Roger grinned. You're a bit late to the party, Eddie. We've all heard about it. Didn't expect you and Scott to be the only ones out of the loop. Oh, Eddie tried to save face. I was tied up with business yesterday. Roger shrugged. Besides classes, you've been running around the first-year dorms hawking your wares. I heard about it too, Scott said, though he hadn't. A hippogriff. You knew? Eddie sounded annoyed. Scott turned to Roger. We should be worried about our care of magical creatures class. Even if young Malfoy wasn't badly hurt, Lucius Malfoy won't let it go. Roger frowned. Yeah, most likely we won't see the hippogriff again. I heard Potter rode it out on the lake. Eddie regretted it as well. He had chosen the class. Professor Kettleburn never actually showed us much. Everything large was left in the books. Hagrid's view of creatures is clearly different. Roger grinned. Not to put too fine a point on it, but Hagrid's idea of animals seems influenced by his own size. After breakfast, Scott had ancient runes, then arithmancy. When arithmancy ended, Professor Victor asked him to stay behind. I noticed, Mr. Trollope. The tall, thin professor peered down at Scott over thick lenses that made his eyes look a little larger than normal. It seems you've made new progress in arithmancy. Scott was a little surprised at how attentive the usually retiring professor had been, but nodded. I've changed my approach, moved away from quills and parchment. I've been focusing on applied techniques. I know you've used arithmancy to help others and even locate the Ravenclaw diadem. Professor Victor's voice was blunt, almost matter-of-fact. Show me your method. Scott drew his wand and, with a neat flick, left a string of golden numerals hanging in the air. Victor watched closely. Indeed, that would make arithmancy much more convenient. When Scott finished demonstrating the whole process, Victor said sharply, Excellent. Your method has given me inspiration. He collected the books from the podium and started for the door. Even knowing Victor's brusque manner, Scott felt momentarily taken aback. Study it, Victor called over his shoulder as he reached the door, then turned briefly, and work harder. When you grow more skilled with arithmancy, you'll be able to simplify the process even further. He left in a rush. Scott smiled to himself and left the classroom. He didn't mind Victor studying his method. It was a simple charms application, after all. If anything, Scott suspected he might learn something useful in return. That evening, he found his usual table in the library to write his essay, with Milton at his side. During potions that afternoon, Snape had spent a conspicuous amount of time staring at Scott, and Milton had been the one to suffer for it. Under that oppressive glance, Milton had become nervous and botched their potion. Snape had savaged the result in front of the whole class and stuck them with an extra essay. Snape had been in a foul mood and extra cutting tonight. Scott and Milton weren't the only targets, but they bore the brunt. I'm so sorry, Scott, Milton kept saying. It's all my fault. Scott was finishing his essay and glanced up at the parchment lying between them. He looked at Milton in surprise. You've only written this much? Milton had never been strong at the practical side of potions. Theoretically, he was fine, but he admitted sheepishly, I didn't listen properly this afternoon. Scott set his pen down and studied him for a moment. You seem distracted. Milton looked down. My father wrote, he wants me to meet him in Hogsmeade. Scott raised an eyebrow. Hogsmeade weekend isn't until the end of October. It's only early September. He scheduled it nearly 2 months in advance, Milton said. You've been unsettled about this for 2 months? Scott handed over his essay. First, finish this potions essay. Milton took the parchment and murmured thanks. Seeing him still subdued, Scott added, "You can't avoid meeting him forever. If you want to live independently, you have to be clear with your father." There were things Scott didn't say. He couldn't tell Milton that each of those meetings might become fewer and farther between if the arrangements fell apart, if the marriage between Mr. Greaves and Mrs. Zabini detonated the way everyone feared. Milton, because of Mrs. Zabini's reputation, already understood that much. What Scott couldn't explain was why Medea had pushed for this match at all. Mr. Greaves was an ordinary employee in the ministry's accidental magical reversal department. Their family was a solid but unremarkable new wizarding household. On paper, he didn't seem worth Medea's intervention. The reasoning behind the match remained a question Scott couldn't yet answer. Early Saturday morning, Scott and Helena arrived at the room of requirement, Helena's private study. Scott stepped back and let her go greet the portrait of the Ravenclaw mentor first. He lingered by the desk to finish a conversation with the portrait that represented Helena herself. "You don't want to interrupt Helena's private talk with her mother?" The Ravenclaw portrait teased with a warm smile. "How thoughtful of you." "It's just politeness," Scott replied, trying to sound modest. "All right, politeness." Helena smoothed her dress and settled onto the painted grass of the landscape frame, her painted skirts rustling as she turned toward him. "How was your summer, Scott?" she asked, eyes bright with curiosity. "Quick, tell me, what fun things did you do?" Scott's mind flickered over a dozen memories, some far darker than he cared to say aloud. He swallowed them down and told her about his time in Spain instead, some of the small adventures and odd little moments that to him had felt unremarkable. The painted girl listened with the enthusiasm of someone who found every detail delightful. "That's wonderful," she sighed, cupping her chin in her hands. "Maybe I should have had more portraits made, so I could travel between all of them." Scott made a helpless face. He only knew Muggle oil painting. The whole art of magical portraits was foreign to him. In the wizarding world, that craft tended to be jealously guarded by old pureblood families, and it hadn't been something he had any access to growing up. He could, of course, learn from the Ravenclaw mentor now, but portrait magic was complicated and not an urgent priority among his many studies. Their conversation didn't last long. Scott soon said his goodbyes and sat down to work. The portrait of the Ravenclaw mentor didn't take the role of a conventional teacher. Instead of lecturing, she worked as a tutor who answered questions, clarified doubts, and offered targeted guidance when Scott hit a wall. She didn't rearrange his study plan for him. She helped him refine it. Scott liked the arrangement. His transfiguration, however, had plateaued. He had mapped out what he wanted to achieve in 4 stages. The first stage was basic transfiguration, the material covered in the lower and middle years at Hogwarts, where any transfigured object required the wizard's conscious control. The second stage was advanced transfiguration, where the results could act independently. Dumbledore's lesson, when he made a little doll move by itself and said, "Magic is the power of belief," had been Scott's nudge in that direction. His first attempt after that had nearly killed him, but after persistent practice, he reached the level where he could use transfiguration reliably in duels. The third stage was high-level transfiguration, the one Scott now judged himself to be on the cusp of. Here transfiguration began to overlap with charms and ancient runes, simple enchantments and runic elements layered into the transfigured form. His listening bat was transfiguration combined with a runic component. The giant oak guardian was transfiguration plus an enlargement charm. The tiny poisonous midge was transfiguration with a shrinking charm. Those were all relatively simple examples. What he wanted next was to weave more complex runic circuits and more powerful charms into his transfigurations, to the point that his creations would behave like alchemical constructs. The third stage also encompassed human transfiguration and eventually mastering animagus transformations. The final stage, the ultimate transfiguration, meant triple-layered work: transfiguration, runic circuits, and charms all seamlessly integrated. Lambo, enlarged once after Scott used an enlargement charm, was only a half-finished proof of concept. He'd had to use a philosopher's stone and even his own blood in the process, so Lambo's enlargeability was more a lucky artifact of desperate measures than a true demonstration of the ultimate technique. Scott wanted to reach the level where he could, with a casual flick, turn a stone into a living dragon that could change size and breathe fire. No shortcuts, no borrowed power. He had already shared this vision with the Ravenclaw mentor, and she had been encouraging. The reason his progress had stalled, she pointed out, was simply that he'd exhausted his current knowledge base. He needed to build a deeper foundation in charms and ancient runes, and accept that he wasn't a prodigy in those fields, but would have to grind his way forward. They finalized a short-term study plan, then the mentor smiled and waved him off. "This is the first weekend after term starts. Go and rest. Enjoy yourself, child. It may be the only weekend you get. "I understand, mentor," Scott said. Helena stayed behind to talk longer, so Scott left the room of requirement on his own. He followed the mentor's advice and treated himself to a proper, restful weekend. Eddie and the Weasley twins had set a threshold so no new arithmancy clients could find him, and Scott enjoyed the rare freedom. On Saturday afternoon, he returned to the duel club after a long break and dispatched several opponents without breaking a sweat. Early Sunday, he activated a secret portkey and went to Oak Cottage, where he spent hours in the forest playing with Lambo. Sunday afternoon brought a makeshift Quidditch match with friends, amateur and chaotic, but great fun. In the evening, the twins and Eddie snuck through the tunnel to Hogsmeade to buy butterbeer and snacks. They rode the shops and streets late into the night and even had an uproarious chase, one with Mr. Filch and another with Peeves. Late that night, Scott lay in bed, smiling as he drifted off to sleep. It had been a pleasant weekend. 284. A painful weekend. A new week arrived, and Scott found himself completely swamped. As a fifth-year student facing the OWLs, his class assignments and essays were more demanding than in any previous year, and they ate up most of his time. Outside regular lessons, he belonged to both the Transfiguration Club and the Charms Club, which only increased his workload. But Scott wasn't satisfied with doing the minimum. Once he made a plan, he meant to carry it out. He squeezed every spare moment out of his days, outside of eating and sleeping, to study in the library and seek guidance from professors. His main focus was human transfiguration, more flexible ways of casting charms, and mastering ancient rune circuits. Human transfiguration was introduced in the fifth-year curriculum, but Scott still needed more. Consultations with Professor McGonagall in the Transfiguration Club, and extra study from the book list she recommended. For flexible charm work, private practice, and Professor Flitwick's instruction were indispensable. Fortunately, Flitwick spared no effort. On Tuesday evenings, when there were no club activities, Scott spent time in the charms training room off Flitwick's office. The runic work was the slowest to improve. Ancient runes were both magic and language, and only steady study and reading would build real proficiency. He tried not to rush that subject. Eagerness alone wouldn't help. As expected, Scott spent the weekend studying. Aside from a scheduled consultation with Professor Babbling on Sunday afternoon, he lived in the room of requirement. Over those 2 days, he reorganized the knowledge he'd hastily absorbed during the week with help from the Ravenclaw mentor in the portrait, aiming to understand and digest it fully. Only then can you better welcome new knowledge next week, the Ravenclaw mentor smiled kindly. At that moment, Scott missed Ravenclaw's diadem more than ever. When he had worn that delicate, clever band, it had been easy to sort and consolidate what he'd learned. It was a terrible temptation. Perhaps his longing showed on his face. Ravenclaw saw through it. "It seems you've already tried the diadem's effect," the portrait observed in her gentle voice. "It was my greatest masterpiece in alchemy. Yes, it is certainly useful." She kept her kind smile, but her next words tightened something in Scott's chest. "I must remind you, when I made the diadem, I was already one of the most powerful wizards of my time, one of the 4 founders of this school." "I'm sorry, mentor," Scott murmured, lowering his head. "I was too lax." "It's normal to want to relax a bit, child," Ravenclaw said. Her gentleness remained unchanged. "But you must overcome it with willpower. Before you reach a certain height, do not rely too much on any object. Rely on your own mind and magic." Scott listened with his head bowed. The portrait smiled and asked, "The arm that wields a sword needs exercise, and the legs that run swiftly need practice. Why would your mind and magic need any less? I understand, Scott said. When my mind is wiser and my magic better carries my will, magical items like the diadem will be more of a help than a crutch. Ravenclaw nodded, satisfied. Scott steadied himself. He was grateful for the portrait's guidance and supervision. Without it, he might have become complacent. By 9 o'clock Sunday evening, he had managed, with difficulty, to reach his goal. He'd used his own mind to do what he'd only imagined possible with the diadem. The portrait had taught him better, more efficient methods for digesting information. 2 days of heavy mental exertion left his head slightly hazy. After leaving the room of requirement, he wandered sluggishly from the 8th floor and took the staircases down. As the stair rotated, he ran into a similarly tired-looking Hermione on the 4th floor landing. "Good evening, Hermione," he said. "You don't look too good." "Good evening, Scott. Same to you," she replied. Scott noticed the tiny golden chain glinting at her collar. "Don't tell me you've been using that over the weekend." "Oh." Hermione hurried to cover the chain with her hand, looking around before lowering her voice. "So, you have one too?" "No," Scott said. "Then how did you know?" she asked, nervous. Ravenclaw students had a semi-open secret. They were observant, and some used time-turners. Scott smiled. "Ravenclaw has always had students who use them. We're good observers. Unusual things tend to get noticed." Hermione's shoulders sagged slightly in relief. Scott was about to say goodbye when she looked puzzled. "How come you don't have one?" she pressed. Scott shrugged. "I only chose 3 electives." "What?" Hermione stared at him as if he had betrayed some sacred principle. "I thought you," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I thought you'd care more about your grades." "You're wrong. I don't care much for exam grades," Scott said. "I care about learning useful knowledge." "I think all knowledge is useful," Hermione replied, disapproving. "That's why the school offers so many courses." "Perhaps," Scott said lightly. "No knowledge is useless, but we aren't gods. We can't be omniscient, so we have to choose what will actually be useful to us." Hermione looked bewildered. "But how you choose, or whether you try to choose everything, must be your decision," Scott went on. "Your choices shape your future," he smiled. "Of course, you could sign up for everything and decide later. Electives let you drop them midterm." With that, he waved as the stair he was on finished its rotation and stepped onto the descending staircase. Scott spent September buried in work. After a month of classes, the 2 new professors at Hogwarts had already acquired completely opposite reputations among the students. Professor Black's defense against the dark arts lessons were popular with almost everyone except the Slytherins. Severus Snape, head of Slytherin, made his dislike of Black obvious, and Black, for his part, was unusually strict with Slytherin pupils, docked their house points at the slightest provocation. According to Eddie, some of the Slytherins had even taken to calling Black a blood traitor in private, which fitted the way pure-blood circles tended to sneer at anyone who consorted with Muggle-borns or fell out of line. If Black's term had been relatively smooth, Hagrid's had gone the other way. It was well known now that his first class had ended in an accident. He had brought hippogriffs to a 3rd-year lesson, and one of the beasts had injured Malfoy. Malfoy was discharged from the hospital a few days later with his right arm in a sling, and he made sure everyone saw it, publicly demanding revenge on Hagrid and the hippogriff. His father, Lucius Malfoy, was said to be working hard to get Hagrid sacked and the creature destroyed. After that, Hagrid looked frightened and swung to the opposite extreme in his teaching. He abandoned dangerous beasts and limited his lessons to creatures the Ministry classified X, dull, or XX, harmless domesticable, maybe at most XXX, manageable by a competent witch or wizard. 3rd years raised flobberworms, 4th years collected horklumps to feed garden gnomes, and 5th years were assigned to help hatch fairy eggs. The classes were widely mocked as unbearably boring. Even Harry, who liked Hagrid, couldn't defend the content. Early October, after a stretch without contact, Medea sent Scott a flu message. It was Saturday evening, October 2nd. He had just left the room of requirement and was walking toward Ravenclaw Tower when the scaly, self-opening bag at his waist began to shake violently, as if something inside wanted to burst free. He knew immediately what that meant and slipped into the utility room off the corridor. While he muttered a few charms to ward off eavesdropping, a small fireplace, kept in a cardboard box in the bag, flew out and landed on the floor. Green flames leapt up and a voice unspooled from them. "Good evening, Scott," Medea said, calm and unhurried. "I gave you 3 minutes to react. That should be enough time to find somewhere private." Scott let out a rueful sound. "Good evening, Medea. You really overestimate me. What if I were in a professor's office right now?" "You could have said you needed the loo," she replied, casual. "All right." He didn't want to waste time on petty complaints. "Is there something you need?" he asked. Medea chuckled. "You never cease to surprise me, Scott. You killed a thief, a dark wizard, and a young dueling champion, didn't you?" "Sorry?" Scott played dumb with exaggerated innocence. "That sounds like a fairy tale. I was on vacation abroad all summer. No thrilling adventures for me." She laughed again. "Of course you'll pretend you don't know. I have no proof, child." "You're making things up," Scott said, annoyed. Medea's tone shifted, thoughtful. "Borgin's death makes it harder to find your father's locket," she mused. "I've discovered that the child, Merope, sold that lullaby of a locket to Borgin for a pittance when she was starving." Her voice went cold and a little mocking. "She was a foolish child, wasn't she?" Scott kept his voice steady. "I don't know who Merope is, but selling a valuable heirloom from Slytherin's line for cheap would be a foolish thing." "You don't know. Of course you don't," Medea said without surprise. "Merope Gaunt, Lord Voldemort's mother, a foolish girl who fell for a muggle and could only think to bind him with love potions." "So, Voldemort, the champion of pureblood supremacy, is actually half-blood?" Scott said with incredulous emphasis. "Yes," Medea replied, contempt in her tone. "Half-blood, born under the influence of a love potion, a child whose head was never quite right." Scott couldn't help asking, "You met him?" Medea answered plainly, "I found him in the forests of Albania, broken, hollowed out." "And now," Scott pressed, hope tightening his voice, "where is he?" "He escaped," Medea said. "He couldn't sacrifice what little of himself he had left to become what his ancestors demanded, so he fled." Scott wanted to cheer. Of course, no one would willingly give up their soul. He forced himself not to sound triumphant and instead said, "It doesn't help if he fled. He split his soul a long time ago. I can find the Horcruxes first." Medea laughed, lightly amused. 7 in total, isn't it? You worked it out with arithmancy." Scott's eyes widened. "How do you know that?" "Because I wanted to know," she replied, dry and unbothered. Scott mulled that over for a beat, then offered a theory. "One of the portraits, maybe one of the old headmasters, went through the portrait network and told you." For some reason, the first portrait he suspected was Phineas Nigellus Black, the most unpopular headmaster in Hogwarts history. "Let's make a deal, Scott." Scott was still wondering who had tipped Medea off when she spoke directly through the flue. "You help me find Tom's Horcruxes, and I'll open the Chamber of Secrets you once visited." Her words were irresistible. Scott let out a slow breath and forced himself to stay calm. "How many Horcruxes have you already got?" he asked. 2. Medea didn't try to hide it. She even volunteered the details. "A ring. I found it in the Gaunt house. And a snake called Nagini. Poor thing. Tom abandoned her when he fled." There was a hint of satisfaction in her voice. Scott drew in a quiet, cold breath. She had used 2 fragments of Voldemort's soul to revive herself. Worse, or perhaps more complicated, one of those Horcruxes was a ring set with the Resurrection Stone, a deathly hallow. In the original story, Dumbledore had been badly injured by the curse left on that ring and was left with only a year to live. From Medea's casual tone, Scott guessed she hadn't suffered anything like that. Specialized knowledge of dark magic, perhaps. Only dark magic could counter dark magic. Dark wizards had advantages against one another. "If my math is right," Scott said slowly, "Voldemort should have 7 Horcruxes in total. Between us, that makes 4 accounted for." He hesitated, then added, "After Riddle's diary was destroyed and Ravenclaw's diadem purified, that leaves 3 more." Green flames danced in the little flue fireplace in his hand. Medea's voice remained unhurried. "You're correct," she said. "I suspected the other 3 were my father's locket, Hufflepuff's cup, and Gryffindor's sword." "I thought the same," Scott answered. Medea continued. "But someone told me Gryffindor's sword has always been kept by successive headmasters in the headmaster's office. It's the only founder's relic that wasn't lost. Scott's confidence grew. So it must be hidden behind a portrait of a former headmaster. Medea laughed softly through the flames. You can guess all you like, but I know you won't tell the current headmaster. He couldn't. He wouldn't explain his sources. He couldn't reveal that Harry was also a Horcrux, or that would put Harry directly in Medea's sights. Medea would need Voldemort's remaining soul to complete her revival, and she would come after Harry without hesitation. Scott might have a flexible moral compass, but he couldn't sacrifice that boy's life for research notes from the Chamber of Secrets. Do you accept the deal, boy? Medea asked, teasing. Scott took another long breath. Sorry, you've overestimated me. If I knew exactly where the Horcruxes were, I would have told Headmaster Dumbledore. He thought of the tempting materials left behind in the chamber, Slytherin's locket, Hufflepuff's cup, and research notes from Medea's family, but he refused. Not just for Harry's sake, he didn't want to hand over the locket or the cup either. It was better for Medea's revival to be slow. If she revived quickly, Scott could be dragged into whatever chaos resulted, and he didn't want that. He wanted freedom, time to grow stronger, not to be swept into politics or wars. Medea's tone turned cold. So you refuse? I'm sorry, madam. I truly can't help you, Scott said. Very well. Her voice softened a touch. If you change your mind, contact me, Scott. One last warning. Though I appreciate a talented young wizard, my patience is limited. Then she cut the connection. The green flames went out. Scott stood in the dark storeroom with the portable flue fireplace in his hand for a long moment, then folded it and slid it into his battered lizard skin bag. He leaned against the door and let out a relieved breath. She really was angry. Only someone calculating and deep could have made such a threat. Walking away from her offer felt like stepping off a tightrope, but he couldn't accept. Beyond Harry, there was the locket and the cup. Revealing them would make Medea's revival faster, and he didn't want that. If Medea and Voldemort kept fighting each other for longer, that gave Scott time to become stronger. Maybe the best outcome was a prolonged struggle between two powerful enemies. He imagined how it might go. Voldemort, fragmented, would flee Medea at first, but he wasn't helpless. He was the final Dark Lord. He would not lack for cunning. Under pressure, he might rally, try to revive sooner, or hide his remaining Horcruxes more securely. If he regained enough power, he wouldn't be weaker than Medea in a straight fight. Medea, silk and web-like, was excellent at weaving alliances. Aside from a few fiercely loyal Death Eaters, many might already have bowed to her. Either way, Scott wanted the conflict to buy him time. He silently pushed open the storeroom and hurried off. The late hour and the delay from the flu call meant curfew had long passed. He extended his magical senses, slipped past Filch and Madame Norris on patrol, and avoided Peeves' usual antics. He made it back to Ravenclaw Tower without incident. Outside the Ravenclaw common room, Scott paused and looked up through the window at the night sky. He smiled, half in disbelief, half in helpless hope. If Voldemort had to try harder, well, so be it. Come on, Dark Lord. Life is like that. Usually calm, but every now and then ripples break the surface. In mid-October, another teaching accident happened at Hogwarts. This time, it was Professor Black at the center of it, and the other party was that ill-fated child, little Malfoy. Word was that the arrogant boy provoked Black in class, and, in a fury, Black hung him from the ceiling for the entire lesson. Unsurprisingly, Malfoy wound up in the hospital wing again, with a dislocated arm. They say Professor Black is Malfoy's uncle. Malfoy's mother was a Black before she married, someone added. At lunch, Eddie was positively buzzing with gossip. It's true, right? Roger leaned in. I hadn't heard that. It's true, Milton said. I remember. Mrs. Malfoy really was a Black. He looked uncomfortable speaking about it. When I was little, my grandfather used to make me learn the tangled family trees of the pureblood houses, Milton said with a sigh. That sounds awful, Milton, Roger said, patting his shoulder without much sympathy. Milton shook his head. Most of those newly rising wizard families are like that, treating the Black family genealogy as if it were a field of study. The table fell a little quiet after Milton's remark, so Eddie seized the moment and steered everyone back to the juicy part. You'll never guess how Malfoy set him off, he said with a grin. Scott glanced at him. Spill it. Eddie's smile widened. Maybe Professor Black loves his godson Potter too much, and Malfoy couldn't stand it. Jealousy, you know? He sped up, eager. Anyway, before class, Malfoy was poking at Potter, saying some pretty nasty things, and Professor Black just snapped. Poor Malfoy probably thought his uncle would spoil him like his father would, Roger shrugged, but he was wrong. Scott was more curious about what exactly Malfoy had said. Eddie cleared his throat dramatically, then launched into an imitation, pushing his chin up to try and mimic Malfoy's sneer. His chin was thicker than the real thing, and his version of Malfoy was only partly convincing, which made the table laugh. "My mother said," he began in a thin, high voice, "the House of Black is forever pure, Potter, and people like you won't be welcome. I, heir of the Malfoys, will be the one welcomed among the Blacks." He went on, putting extra emphasis on the insults. Professor Black was kicked out of the family the day the Sorting Hat put him in Gryffindor. After that, he stuck with your father's lot and ended up living with the Potters. Uncle Regulus is the rightful heir of the House of Black. Professor Black went wrong because he fell in with people like your father. Old Potter did a lot of damage, if you ask me. Eddie threw his hands up and snapped back into his own face. So that's what went down. Professor Black got him silent and hung him from the ceiling for the whole class. He smirked and sat back. Scott thought Malfoy had brought it on himself. Insulting Black's dead friend as well as Potter was bound to provoke a reaction. If he'd attacked Black directly, the professor might have ignored a student's insolence, but this was different. Suddenly, the Weasley twins burst into the Great Hall, shouting at the top of their voices. "Professor Black! Professor Snape! They're dueling." The hall went suddenly electric. Students leapt from their seats. "Where? Move! I can't miss this." Lee Jordan was already sprinting toward them. Eddie practically screeched, "No way I'm missing it." "In the courtyard," Fred called, flapping his hand like a guide. Lunch forgotten, almost everyone surged for the doors. "Make way! Move aside!" The corridors around the square courtyard filled with curious students. The air was tense and expectant. Scott watched Harry pushing his way through the crowd, a desperate look on his face. Hermione was near him, yelling, "We should get the other teachers. Professor McGonagall, Dumbledore. No time." Harry forced out and ran. When Scott reached the courtyard, he saw Snape and Black standing under the statue of the monstrous guardian at the center. They weren't yet dueling, but both had their wands out and were pointing them at each other. The crowd pressed in, silent. Black, who seemed to enjoy the attention, boomed loudly, "As defense against the dark arts professor, I have the right to discipline unruly students, Snevolus." He lingered on defense against the dark arts and spat Snevolus with relish. Snape's nostrils flared. "How dare you, you mangy mad dog," he snarled and lashed out with his wand. "Sectum Sempra." Black dropped and rolled just in time. The flagstone where he'd been was sliced, the mark a grim testament to the charm's path. He dodged an invisible attack. Even rolling, he kept his wand moving, countering from an odd angle. "Reducto," he snapped. Snape merely sneered and flicked away the effects with a contemptuous motion. "Sectum Sempra," he tried again, then barked, "Confringo." The spells crisscrossed the courtyard when an aged voice suddenly cut through the roar. "Protego." A shimmering, transparent shield sprang up between them and deflected both charms. Dumbledore strode forward, wand in hand, standing between the two dueling professors as the crowd exhaled in unison. 288. Singing and dancing Weasley, the end of the incident, Severus Sirius. Dumbledore strode into the courtyard, calling the two professors by name. His face was uncharacteristically grave, stripped of his usual kindly air. "Gentlemen, this is most disappointing," he said as he approached the two men who had been fighting. Scott realized for the first time that Dumbledore's slight, frail-looking frame actually made him taller than the two broad-shouldered, middle-aged wizards before him. Snape glanced at Dumbledore, then dropped his wand. His face went ashen and he said nothing. "Sorry, Professor Dumbledore," Black muttered, scrambling to his feet, embarrassed. "But I must say, Professor Snape is far too nosy." Snape snorted coldly, clutched his robe at the lapels, and answered with frosty dignity, "I must remind you, Professor Black, Mr. Malfoy is a Slytherin student, and I am the head of Slytherin." Everyone could see the hesitation in the middle of Snape's sentence was deliberate, a refusal to give an inch. Black was about to reply when Dumbledore raised his hand and cut them off. "I would like both professors to come to my office now," he said, and turned back toward the castle. Black and Snape exchanged a look, then both averted their eyes in disdain before following Dumbledore inside. No sooner had the three professors left than the courtyard erupted. The students who'd witnessed the scuffle clustered together, buzzing. "Oh, oh, oh!" Eddie bounced in place. "I've never seen anything like it. So exciting. If only Dumbledore hadn't shown up so fast." He lowered his voice for that last remark. If they had kept fighting, who would have won? Professor Snape, of course. It would definitely be Professor Black. A debate broke out as students argued over which professor had been stronger. Shouts rose and clashed. "Professor Snape is the head of Slytherin. He's only the potions master. Professor Black is defense against the dark arts. That defense against the dark arts professor got beaten by Snape last time. Black's not the same. He's a hero." Just as the argument threatened to spill into blows, an annoying, tuneless song piped up. "The two professors are fighting, Snape and Black." Eyes turned to the source. The Weasley twins had teamed up with Peeves. Fred and George linked arms and danced toward the monstrous statue in the center of the courtyard, Peeves shrieking and waving in time. Every time the twins sang a line, Peeves would interrupt with a screech. "No, it's Snivellus and the Mad Dog. The two professors are fighting, Snape and Black. No, it's Snivellus and the Mad Dog. The two professors are fighting, Snape and Black. No, it's Snivellus and the Mad Dog." Scott's mouth twitched. Singing at the drop of a hat, what were they, performing some bawdy ballad? Before he could think anymore, Hermione pushed through the crowd. "No, stop it. This is extremely disrespectful." The twins and Peeves ignored her and kept up the song and dance. Percy, beet red with fury, charged in. "Fred, George," he shouted, waving his wand. "Detention. You'll be given detentions. I'll write to." "Tell Mum," the twins chorused, then changed the words on the fly into a new taunt. "Percy, Percy, our head boy, good for nothing else but tattling's his claim to fame." Percy trembled with rage. With a determined flick, he tried to subdue his brothers with a charm, but Peeves darted in, snatched Percy's wand, and with wicked timing burst a water balloon over Percy's head. "How dare you, Peeves? I am the head boy!" Percy roared, his hair dripping. Peeves grinned and joined the twins in a high-pitched chorus. "Percy, Percy, our head boy, good for nothing else, but tattling's his claim to fame." Laughter cracked across the courtyard. Eddie, still laughing, nudged Penelope. "Penelope, why aren't you going to rescue your boyfriend?" "Oh." Penelope smoothed a lock of her bright, beautiful curls. "I don't want my hair to get wet. Professor McGonagall is here." A hush ran through the students. Scott looked up to see McGonagall standing in the castle doorway, staring icily at the mischief makers. The twins stopped mid-step. Peeves let go of Percy's wand with a shriek and fled. The courtyard fell into a hush. But one voice kept going. "Percy, Percy, our head boy, good for nothing else, but tattling's his claim to fame." All eyes swung to Ron, who had his back to everyone and was singing and dancing at Harry like an overexcited monkey. He hadn't noticed McGonagall's arrival or Harry's twitching expression, and he was still reveling in the mockery. "Ron," Harry had reached the end of his patience. He pushed Ron, spun him around. "Tattling is his claim to hick!" Under McGonagall's severe stare, Ron hiccuped, his face collapsing into mortified tears. A ripple of stifled laughter went around Scott, and he couldn't help but smile. The Weasleys were always good for a laugh, and Ron always seemed to pay the price. "To Mr. Weasley's," Scott murmured. McGonagall marched into the courtyard and fixed the twins with a look before turning to Ron. "And you, Mr. Ronald Weasley." The lanky boy shrank inward. "Because of your improper behavior, Gryffindor will lose 60 points, she said, "and all three Mr. Weasleys will serve 2 weeks after-school detention." "Leave them to me, Professor McGonagall." Filch swaggered in, Madame Norris winding round his legs, his face a picture of glee. "I'll teach those mischievous brats a lesson they'll never forget." McGonagall nodded. "Then I'll leave them to you, Mr. Filch." Filch marched the 3 Weasley boys away, triumphant. McGonagall glanced over the courtyard. "Well, what are you all still staring at?" The students scattered like birds. "Oh, this is the best day since school started," Eddie said on the way back, grinning. "Now Malfoy has one more professor to deal with," Roger added, shaking his head. Can Lucius Malfoy get 2 professors sacked at once? Honestly, we don't want Professor Black to be fired, another classmate said. But the Malfoys sit on the school board. The speculation meant little, but it reminded Scott of how events had unfolded in the original story. In the original timeline, the Malfoys lost their seat on the school board the year before, after the Chamber of Secrets affair. There was no one to speed up its resolution, and Lucius Malfoy used his influence to push for Dumbledore's dismissal. With the chamber incident unresolved for longer, things escalated. Dumbledore was briefly removed as headmaster, then returned after the crisis was solved and the Malfoys were punished. Here, Scott's presence had altered the course of events. Because he helped ensure the chamber was resolved quickly the previous year, the Malfoys still held their board seat. Another divergence was that Dobby the house elf had not been freed. As for Hagrid and Black, neither held the weight of Dumbledore's authority. Whether Lucius would try to leverage for their dismissal was uncertain. A shrewd man like Lucius Malfoy would know that using threats to coerce the other board members was risky. It was rumored Lucius had stormed into Hogwarts in high dudgeon that afternoon and left with an even grimmer face, as though he'd failed to best Dumbledore. At breakfast the next day, Dumbledore announced his decision to the whole school. Neither Hagrid nor Black would be dismissed. Instead, he had appointed additional teaching assistants for both care of magical creatures and defense against the dark arts. He did not mention the fighting or the incidents that had precipitated the decision. His explanation was that both subjects posed unique risks and required extra staff to protect the students. It looks like Dumbledore managed to keep Hagrid and Black in their posts. Lucius Malfoy's attempt failed, Eddie whispered. Scott thought that made sense. In the original story, Dumbledore's dismissal had been a response to the school's unsafe condition. The repeated attacks and petrifications made it hard to defend him. But in these recent incidents, young Malfoy himself had shared some of the blame, and his injuries were minor. It was far easier for Dumbledore to argue against dismissing Hagrid or Black. There were later rumors the 3 professors, Hagrid, Black, and Snape, had all suffered pay cuts. But whatever the truth, the handful of episodes in the new term were over. Except for a sulking young Malfoy and his cronies, the students had put it all behind them and turned their attention to the changes the new assistants might bring to 2 of their favorite classes. Hogwarts had become unusually efficient overnight, or rather, Professor Dumbledore had, once he decided to be. The morning after he announced his decision, 2 new assistant professors were presented to the staff and students. One was a young witch, the other a middle-aged wizard. The witch had short, pale gray hair, a round, friendly face, and a lively smile. Her robes hung open to reveal long legs in snug trousers and tall boots. A lit pipe in her hand added an unconventional air. The wizard looked far more worn. Light brown hair shot through with gray, patched robes, scuffed leather shoes, and a tired, almost sickly expression. Standing between them, Dumbledore announced loudly, "Wilhelmina Graupeland. Miss Graupeland has agreed to serve as assistant professor for care of magical creatures. Before this, she worked in the Ministry's Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures." "Hello, everyone," Wilhelmina called cheerfully. "It's an honor to be here. Well, it's wonderful to be back a few years after graduating. I love Hogwarts." Applause broke out immediately. The students liked her at once. She seemed bright, energetic, and a little daring. Thank you all." She gave a graceful bow, her smile warm. "I should say I only stayed at the ministry for a month before resigning. I couldn't stand that routine life." She raised the pipe and took a puff. "This is sage tobacco I made myself. It helps me think, and no, it won't harm you or me." More applause followed. "She must be a Ravenclaw," a boy nearby murmured. Wilhelmina walked to the staff table amid approving murmurs and sat next to Hagrid, already chatting with him like an old friend. Dumbledore continued, "Remus Lupin, also an excellent wizard, will serve as assistant professor for defense against the dark arts." Before Dumbledore finished, Professor Black at the staff table began to clap loudly. Dumbledore looked surprised for a moment, then smiled and joined in. Soon the whole staff and the students were applauding. Remus Lupin seemed taken aback, but bowed politely. Professor Black's enthusiasm didn't stop there. He sprang from the table. laughing, and embraced Remus. "Oh, they know each other," Eddie said, clapping. "Professor Black's found his assistant. Will Professor Snape apply too?" one of the boys joked. "Do you really want them to fight again?" Roger muttered, elbowing him. When Black threw his arm around Remus, Snape's face at the table went ashen. His glare could have set Fiendfire alight. Remus bowed again. "Thank you, Professor Dumbledore. I hope I can be of help to the students." "You can. You certainly can, Remus," Black said affectionately, keeping his arm around him. "I didn't expect you to be the one helping me. Nothing could be better." "Humph," Snape snorted, slamming his cup down. "I certainly hope so," he said shortly, "and it had better be, without incidents." Black looked ready to leap across the table at him. Remus held him back gently. "Hello, Severus," Remus said calmly. Snape glanced away, dismissive. Black's face darkened, and Remus had to pull him back to avoid a repeat altercation. Over the following weeks, the two new assistants made marked, positive changes in their departments. Care of magical creatures was transformed first. Wilhelmina's arrival revived the course. Hagrid's enthusiasm for magical beasts, always strong but sometimes overwhelmed by his chaotic methods, seemed to be rekindled under her influence. The classes became more ambitious and far more orderly. Students were introduced to new and dangerous species, and Wilhelmina's organization kept chaos to a manageable level. Scott and his friends even got to ride hippogriffs, an exhilarating, slightly terrifying experience. Hagrid and Wilhelmina proved a good team. Hagrid could find unusual creatures, and Wilhelmina could marshal and arrange the classes so everyone could learn safely. Students quickly dubbed her the amazing Wilhelmina Gropeland. She lived up to the nickname. In one recent lesson, she led a herd of unicorns out of the Forbidden Forest so that the students could see them up close, though, as was usual, only the girls were allowed near the unicorns. Unicorns were proud and aloof. They tolerated no rough handling and reacted badly to the approach of boys. Hagrid, who had handled thestrals and even a few more dangerous beasts, admitted he couldn't tame them. By a quiet stream in the forest, Wilhelmina supervised a group of lively girls playing with the graceful unicorns. It was a lovely sight. The boys crouched in the distance with Hagrid, watching enviously and listening to his excited commentary. Scott, Roger, and the Weasley twins stayed together. "Maybe we can pick up some unicorn tail hair after class," George said, eyes shining. "I'm sure Mr. Ollivander would pay handsomely for it." George didn't notice that Fred was not listening. Fred's gaze had been following Angelina Johnson, the tall, athletic girl splashing happily among the unicorns. All in all, care of magical creatures became enjoyable again. Hagrid praised his new assistant often, and Wilhelmina was quick to praise Hagrid's knack for taming fierce animals. The pair got along well, and the subject regained its popularity. Defense against the dark arts changed just as dramatically with Remus Lupin's arrival. His partnership with Professor Black, old friends, proved extremely effective. Where Black was loud and passionate, Remus was calm and precise. He could point out gaps in Black's methods without undermining him, treat Slytherin students more fairly, and temper Black's emotional extremes. After Remus joined, Professor Black began deducting far fewer points from Slytherin, much to Snape's obvious displeasure. Snape continued to show open contempt for both Black and Remus whenever he could. What truly made the class soar, though, were the practical lessons. Black and Remus demonstrated duels between seasoned wizards, real, dangerous magic, not the back-and-forth games students usually played. Those demonstrations showed the students what adult combat looked like: intensity, subtlety, and the ever-present risk. It was a far cry from the sparring matches the pupils treated as sport. Scott, in particular, felt the change. In the school context, his dueling often felt like play. There were no peers who could press him to his limits, so he couldn't display or refine his real abilities. Remus and Black's demonstrations provided a concrete benchmark. Watching and sparring with two wizards who had seen real war taught the students what to strive for. Both professors often served as Scott's personal practice opponents. That was invaluable. He wasn't their equal yet. There was a clear gap in raw magical power, awareness, and battlefield experience, but facing them helped him develop the combat sense he lacked. Scott's previous great achievements, he thought, had mostly come from sneak attacks and assassination-style tactics. His few victories in straight fights against Jasmine Travers, the now graduated Idris Stryerner, a handful of Slytherins, and the thief Fletch were exceptions, not the rule. Fletch, cunning as he was, had never had the strength or training of someone like Stryerner. Magic power had to grow naturally. Experience and awareness were things one learned only through practice and exposure. For Scott, the arrival of Remus Lupin and the extra time Black and Remus could now give to practical training was perhaps the most beneficial change of all. The practical lessons finally stopped feeling like games and started feeling like preparation for whatever lay beyond Hogwarts' walls. There was a reason Lupin could be good friends with Black and Harry's father. The supposedly steady, middle-aged man had a mischievous streak. By late October, everything had settled back into place. During a third-year Defense Against the Dark Arts lesson, Lupin, just like in the original story, quietly nudged Neville through his instructions, and Neville made the boggart that had taken Snape's form come out dressed in his grandmother's clothes. The story spread through the school in no time. According to witnesses, Snape was wearing a long, lace-trimmed dress, a tall hat with an old, moth-eaten stuffed bird perched on top, and a large scarlet handbag swinging from his hand. Students in the next classroom had allegedly heard Black laughing. The prank left Snape with even more reason to despise Lupin and Black, and it made Neville's potions lessons harder than ever. A few days later, Scott went to the greenhouse outside the castle at a time other than herbology class and found Neville alone, crouched by a flower pot and rubbing at his eyes. "Hey, are you all right, Neville?" he asked. Neville looked up, cheeks flushed. "Oh, I'm fine." He pushed himself to his feet. "Hello, Scott." "I need some yarrow," Scott said as he walked over. "I asked Professor Sprout about it." Neville hurried to wipe his face with his sleeve. "I know where the yarrow is. I'll take you." Scott pulled a note from his pocket and handed it to him. "This has Professor Sprout's signature. She said you're helping take care of the puff pod. Maybe you could help me pick some yarrow?" Neville took the note and brightened. "Of course. I'd be happy to help." "Thank you, Neville." Scott smiled. "Professor Sprout speaks highly of you. She's impressed with your herbology work." Neville blushed. "It's nothing. I just like looking after the plants." He led Scott past rows of fanged geraniums toward the far side of the greenhouse. "This is really your strength," Scott said. "Things I'm hopeless at." "You're good at other things," Neville said shyly. "Not everything," Scott replied. "I'm not great at herbology or potions. Astronomy and history of magic are only average. Everyone's different." "Thank you," Neville said, glancing back at him. "You're encouraging me. I've told you before, be more confident. You've improved a lot." Neville nodded, then hesitated. "But Professor Snape, my potions lesson today was a disaster." "Snape makes a lot of people nervous," Scott said, "including my roommate Milton. When Snape looks at him, he freezes up and makes mistakes." Neville immediately nodded in sympathy. "If you ask me, you don't really need to be afraid of him." Scott spoke in a casual tone. "He won't actually hurt you. It's mostly verbal, harsh remarks, sarcasm. When you hear it, just grow a thicker skin and pretend you didn't hear him." Neville looked surprised, then Scott patted his shoulder encouragingly. Neville gave a tired little smile. "Thank you. I'll try." They stopped in front of a small patch of yarrow. Neville squatted and began picking the herb with quick, practiced movements, talking as he worked. "Yarrow reduces swelling, staunches bleeding, eases pain. Native Americans used to boil the root to strengthen muscles. Wearing it is supposed to ward off evil. Drinking yarrow tea before divination is said to heighten perception. In some tales, it's even called devil's nettle, a favorite of demons." "You're really good at this, Neville." Scott watched him with interest. "I want to see if yarrow tea can sharpen perception for arithmancy." "Yarrow tea?" Neville looked up. "You need fresh yarrow to make it. If you trust me, I can brew some." Scott grinned. "Thank you. I'll leave it to you." They arranged a time for Neville to make the tea, and Scott left the greenhouse in a cheerful mood. The idea of using ritual, however old-fashioned it might seem, to help settle into the right frame of mind had come from the Ravenclaw mentor, who liked reminding students that certain small rituals could be useful. Scott had taken the advice. Professor Sprout had seemed a little surprised when Scott asked privately for yarrow. His herbology grades were middling, and he didn't usually ask for favors. Still, she didn't refuse. October was busy for Scott, but by then he'd grown used to pushing himself. Habit is a powerful thing. After a couple of days of intense work at the weekend, his spirits stopped sinking like they had at the beginning of term. October 31st, 1993, a Sunday, was Halloween Eve. Scott left the room of requirement early to go to the feast. The great hall was decorated once more with giant pumpkins, black candles, fluttering bats, and trays of sweets, but Scott was mostly looking forward to the food. When he reached the long table, his 3 roommates turned to look at him. "Oh, the elusive Scott, the mysterious Scott," Eddie teased in a smug voice. "Where were you this morning? I woke up and you were already gone." "Studying," Scott said, shaking a notebook in his hand. "Studying," Roger blinked. "This guy forgot today is our first Hogsmeade weekend of the year. And Roger's 5-month single anniversary," Eddie crowed. Scott ignored them and sat down. He turned to Milton. "Sorry, I really forgot. How did your meeting with Mr. Greaves go?" "It went fine," Milton said with a smile. "Better than I expected." "How so?" Scott asked. "My dad, I don't know if he came to any clearer conclusions or just got more confused." Milton said, looking oddly thoughtful. "He told me I don't need to go home anymore." Eddie muttered, "I think Mr. Greaves definitely got more confused," and Roger covered his mouth to stop himself from saying more. Scott glanced between them and asked Milton, "What do you think?" "For me, it's good, isn't it?" Milton gave a somewhat forced smile. "At least my request was granted. My dad said he'll take some of the pressure off my grandfather. But a father telling his underage son he doesn't need to go home, that was odd." Scott and Roger exchanged a look that said the same thing. "Did your grandfather contact you before this?" Eddie asked, freeing his hand from Roger's grip. Milton shook his head. "Grandfather doesn't care about me personally. He cares about the Greaves name, not any one person." "So do you have plans for the future?" Scott asked. "My dad will pay my tuition and living expenses until graduation. During holidays, I'll stay in the flat my mum left. My dad and grandfather don't know about it." After graduation, Milton thought for a moment and then smiled. "I want to audition for the London Philharmonic." "But your musical ability," Eddie began, and Roger quickly clapped a hand over his mouth again. "It's okay," Milton said. "With steady practice, my playing won't slip." "If you don't get into the Philharmonic, try other orchestras," Roger advised. "You'll find your place." Eddie hastily offered encouragement. Then, hesitantly, he asked, "You're planning to leave the magical world and live in the Muggle world after graduation? I mean, you were training combat skills before. Why not join the Weird Sisters?" "I train so I can protect myself," Milton said with a small smile. "That's not a conflict, and I left the Weird Sisters last semester. I'm no longer their reserve member." "You could try again," Roger said. "They might accept you." Milton shook his head. "They're brilliant musicians. I don't think I'm at their level. Besides," he looked up, his eyes catching the glow of the Halloween candles overhead, "I have a feeling that one day I'll see my mother at a concert. She'll be doing well, and I'll be able to tell her I'm doing well too." "That day will come," Scott said. "Of course. Definitely." Roger, Eddie, and Scott agreed, and for a moment the future felt full of possibility. Today's update is complete. Although there are still 3 chapters, the word count per chapter has increased to about 3,000, meaning over 9,000 words were updated today. In short, please vote. After Dumbledore announced the start of the Halloween feast, an exceptionally lavish spread of food appeared on the long tables. Piles of meats, fruits, and pastries stacked high. Milton composed himself and smiled at Scott and the others. "Don't let my affairs spoil your holiday. Enjoy the feast." He stood and walked toward the front of the staff table. Students from the houses rose with him. "Good evening, everyone," Professor Flitwick called, looking unusually excited. "Please enjoy a performance from the Toad Choir and the Classical Music Club." Flitwick stepped to the center of the great hall and waved his wand. Countless specks of light scattered and a beautifully arranged stage sprang into being before the staff table. Pianos, cellos, violins, and Scottish bagpipes set on either side glinted in the candlelight. Milton and the Classical Music Club took their places. Caccini, Roger's ex, bowed elegantly and sat at the piano. A giant pumpkin lantern rose at Flitwick's feet. He waved his wand again, and the musicians began to play. "Croak! Croak, croak. Toad croaks punctuated the music as members of the Toad Choir, each holding a large toad, rose from the house tables and began to sing along. Their lyrics were lifted from Macbeth. Double, double toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. Double, double toil and trouble, something wicked this way comes. They walked onto the stage in neat rows as the music swelled. Eye of newt and toe of frog, wool of bat and tongue of dog, adder's fork and blind worm's sting, lizard's leg and owlet's wing. The music grew more spirited. Human voices and toad croaks wove together. The choir's human singers joined, creating an eerie trio of tones. The pumpkin beneath Flitwick bobbed in time. Flitwick conducted, his gestures growing grander. As the last lines of the song sounded, every pumpkin lantern in the hall rose and bobbed in the air to the rhythm. Black bats among the candles scattered and weaved through the lanterns. Then, as the final lyric ended, Flitwick's baton stopped. The lanterns settled, and the bats returned with a whoosh. Flitwick bowed. The pumpkins descended. Deafening applause filled the great hall. The Toad Choir and musicians bowed and stepped off stage. Flitwick hopped down, waved his wand, and the dreamlike stage dissolved into glittering motes. Cheers continued for a long time. "I loved that. Much better than last year's skeleton dance," Eddie told Milton as he returned to his seat. "If I heard right, those lyrics are from Macbeth?" Roger added excitedly. "Truly magical." "Yes," Milton replied with a smile. "To this day, we still don't know whether Shakespeare was a muggle or a wizard. That question always sparks debate." The Halloween feast ended on a joyful note. That night, Scott lay awake thinking about the charm that always caused trouble on Halloween in the original story, if it was indeed broken this time. Early the next morning, he left Ravenclaw Tower and met Luna on the corridor by the kitchens. Her hair was a little messy, and she carried a small knitted shoulder bag. "Good morning, Scott," Luna said with a smile. "Morning. Where are you going?" he asked. "I got some fruit and meat from the kitchens," she answered, patting her bag. "I'm going to feed a little fellow in the Forbidden Forest. Want to come?" Scott raised an eyebrow. "A little fellow?" "It's a thestral," Luna said. "Oo and a female had a baby. Oo's the leader of the herd." Scott nodded. He had seen a car accident in Spain that summer, and as at the start of term, found he could see thestrals now. "I'll come see. I saw one this summer." They walked through the castle's back garden and into the forest where a white morning mist drifted. Luna seemed to know the path well. "I saw them through the window at the feast," she said dreamily. "Them flying at night fit Halloween perfectly." "Do you come see them often?" Scott asked. "Occasionally," Luna said. "A lot of people dislike how they look, but I think they're rather splendid." Thestrals had a bad reputation in the wizarding world. They were large but gaunt, their black hides clinging to bone, dragon-like heads with pupilless white eyes, long black tails, and huge bat wings growing between their shoulder blades. They could only be seen by people who had seen death, and they preferred to be active at night. They walked deeper, through a dense grove, and reached a wide clearing. The adults weren't there. "Oh, they don't seem to be here," Luna said. Scott guessed. "Maybe they moved somewhere else." Luna shook her head. "No, the Thestrals only like to move about at night. During the day, they hide in darker places." She imitated a whinnying call. "Whinny, whinny," a small Thestral answered, wobbling out of a nearby bush with an unsteady whinny. It was young, its voice thin and its steps unsure. "Oh, little fellow!" Luna ran over, pulled an apple from her bag, and fed it to the foal. "Slow down. Eat slowly. Where are your parents? Where's your herd?" The foal finished the apple and rubbed its ugly head against Luna with anxious whinnies. "Don't worry, there's more," she murmured, offering another apple. "But something's wrong," Luna said after a moment. "All the adult Thestrals are gone. They wouldn't leave a foal alone. They're Hagrid's tamed Thestral herd, right? Maybe someone needs them to pull carriages." Scott suggested, though even he thought it a bit far-fetched. "You stay with him," Scott said. "I'll go ask Hagrid." "I'll leave it to you, then," Luna said, and Scott set off out of the forest. Hagrid's snoring reached him as soon as he arrived at the hut. He knocked on the door. Inside, Fang barked fiercely. "Shut up, you woke me, Fang," Hagrid roared, rolling out of bed. Scott knocked again and called, "Professor Hagrid! Professor Hagrid! Oh, someone's looking for me! I'm coming!" Hagrid shouted. There was the clatter of a stool as he moved. He opened the door, looked down at Scott, and blinked. "Oh, Trollop from Ravenclaw. Morning." He smelled of last night's drinks. "Is there something you need?" he asked, rubbing his hair. He started to close the door and beckoned him in, muttering, "Where did I put me tea leaves?" "No need to come in," Scott said loudly. "The Thestrals in the Forbidden Forest are all gone." Hagrid went deathly quiet for a heartbeat, then exploded. He lurched out of the hut like a bull, both hands planted on the doorframe as he leaned forward and stared at Scott. Are you saying the Thestrals are gone?" His huge hands made the wood creak. 292. The first week of November, yes, the Thestrals are gone. Facing Hagrid's mountain of a presence, Scott took 2 careful steps back. If Hagrid got excited and squeezed him without thinking, Scott was fairly certain his bones would be crushed. "It's like this," he said quietly. "Luna Lovegood and I went into the Forbidden Forest to visit the newborn Thestrals, and all the adults were gone. Only the foal was left." "Merlin," Hagrid breathed, aghast. Scott continued, "Luna said it wasn't normal, so she asked me to come and ask you if you knew what happened." "Oh, Merlin's beard. Of course it isn't normal," Hagrid bellowed, rocking the doorframe with his shout. "Something's happened. Otherwise, they wouldn't have just up and left. I know them better than anyone. Thestrals are loyal. Once they bond, they don't leave their owners." He muttered as he went in to pull on his hefty fur coat. "They'd only go if something dragged their attention away," he said as he hurried back out, barely keeping from tackling Scott in his rush. "I'm off to check it once. Fang, come on!" His boarhound Fang followed him into the forest, and Scott slipped after them. They reached the clearing where the herd had grazed. Hagrid searched frantically but found no sign of the adults. He cradled the little Thestral and wept aloud. It was nearly time for class, so Scott and Luna had to leave. "Sorry, Professor Hagrid," Scott said. "We have classes." "You go on, go to class," Hagrid said, voice thick with tears. "I'll keep looking. The Forbidden Forest is huge. Maybe they wandered somewhere else." Luna frowned. Could they have wandered somewhere else? Under what circumstances would they leave a foal behind? Hagrid choked out one possibility. Only one thing would draw them off like that: the scent of fresh blood. It drives them wild. Scott raised an eyebrow. So someone could have lured the herd away with blood? "They're loyal. They'd only be temporarily distracted," Hagrid snapped. "Some foul creature must have taken them." He produced a handkerchief the size of a tablecloth, blew his nose with a sound like a foghorn, stuffed the dirty thing back into his pocket, and bent to hug the foal once more. Tears tracked down his face. "Oh, you poor thing. I'll find your mum and dad, I promise." "We should go," Scott told Luna. She nodded. "We can't do much here." They said goodbye and left. On the way back, Scott suggested, "Maybe what you saw last night was them leaving," he sighed. The old superstition about something always happening on Halloween Eve seemed not yet broken. It was nevertheless strange that Hogwarts' Thestral herd had been taken. The news didn't spread far. Few students even knew Thestrals existed. Most assumed the carriages that met them at Hogsmeade Station were self-driving. Scott didn't involve himself further, but Luna kept following the case. According to Luna, Hagrid and several professors combed the Forbidden Forest over the next few days. They even enlisted the centaur herd, but found no clues. Hagrid continued teaching, but his spirit sagged. Fortunately, he had an assistant, the amazing Grapeland, who could take over when Hagrid was unwell, and thanks to Grapeland, the Care of Magical Creatures class didn't fall behind. November arrived with a sudden drop in temperature across the Highlands. Winter set in. But the cold did nothing to cool the campus. Quidditch season was beginning, and atmosphere ran hot. Each house's team trained relentlessly, and fans argued, cheered, and sometimes fought over loyalties. Ravenclaw's team was in brutal training. After last year's captain Benjamin Bruce graduated, Scott's roommate Roger Davies had taken the armband. Roger had complained about Bruce's intense regime, but now that he was captain himself, he'd gone even further. Dawn to dusk training in all weathers and even overnight drills. One Thursday, they returned to the dorm, exhausted only minutes before curfew. "Last year, we won the House Cup, but we missed the Quidditch Cup," Roger told his roommates. Bruce wanted a cup before he left, but he didn't manage it. "We didn't lose because of the team," Eddie protested. "Slytherin had Nimbus 2001s. Our gear couldn't compete." Roger dried his wet hair with a towel. Gryffindor and Hufflepuff aren't that different equipment-wise. Everyone's working hard. No one's going to hand the cup to Slytherin because of broom differences. This year, only you and Cedric are new captains, Eddie observed. Gryffindor's Captain Wood and Slytherin's Flint aren't graduating, so they don't need to change much. Yes, Roger said, smiling. Hufflepuff is training hard too. Cedric and I both want to make our first year count. Is that why you've been single since breaking up with Caccini? Scott teased. Eddie threw his head back and laughed. I think so. Roger's been single over 5 months now, record-breaking since 1989. He even gave a mock applause. Roger swore and lobbed the wet towel at Eddie's head. You git! I'm sweaty! Eddie grabbed it and threw it back. Scott edged away. Even from a distance, the smell was strong. Once they'd stopped roughhousing, Scott asked, the opening match this week is Slytherin versus Hufflepuff, right? That's it. Our first match isn't until the 3rd Saturday of November, so we've still got time. Roger relaxed a little. By the way, if anyone has good ideas for the team, tell me. I don't have any brilliant ideas, Scott said. He was never one to offer advice on things he didn't know. What about this year's recruits? Eddie asked. Any talented new players? Not really, Roger admitted. The newcomers barely filled the 2 places vacated by graduates. Our lineup's a bit thin. Scott understood why Roger, desperate for an edge, was casting around for help. He suggested, you could broaden your horizons. There are plenty of sharp Ravenclaws who understand strategy. Maybe form a coaching or tactical advisory group. Eddie liked the idea. Like Muggle football clubs, a coach doesn't have to be the star player, just understand the game. Scott added, as captain, you can pick which advice to follow. You'll need judgment to filter the good from the bad. Roger brightened. That's a good plan. I'll ask around tomorrow and see who'll help. Thanks to Roger's energy, Ravenclaw formally set up a Quidditch tactical advisory group on Friday. Eddie joined too, officially as an intelligence officer, scouting opponents, so everyone had their part to play. 293. Scott's Saturday Roar. Although there was a Quidditch match between Slytherin and Hufflepuff that Saturday, Scott still entered the room of requirement in the early morning with a full day's provisions. Good morning, Helena. He stepped into Helena's study, closed the door, and spoke to the portrait. The young woman in the painting sat with her back to the viewer, fingers curled around a thin silver spoon as she stirred something in a porcelain cup. Good morning, Scott, she answered without turning her head. Her tone was perfunctory. Scott smiled inwardly. Familiarity had bred this coolness. He didn't always linger in the room with the Ravenclaw portrait when he studied here. Apart from consulting his mentor, he usually worked on his own, but they'd spent enough time together that the young Helena no longer displayed curiosity or her original warmth. I need you to open the door for me, Helena, Scott said, trying for a plaintive note. Yes, I need you to open the door. Helena set the silver spoon down, rose slowly, and muttered, I shouldn't have agreed to this chore in the first place. Heaven knows I only meant to make things difficult for the other Helena when she came here. She passed through several other paintings, then stepped into the largest landscape. The frame slid aside, and a wooden door appeared. All right, hurry in, the portrait waved. Thank you. Scott pushed open the door and stepped through, bowing respectfully to the Ravenclaw portrait. Good morning, Professor. You're here. The portrait looked up. Let's begin. Scott went to his seat, took out his notebook, and started asking the questions he'd collected over the week. No matter what he asked, Ravenclaw answered without hesitation and pushed his understanding further. All Scott had to do was ask and absorb. Of course, he'd need time later to digest it all. Fortunately, after their recent sessions, his capacity for learning and integrating new ideas had accelerated. As Ravenclaw had said, the mind needs exercise. A frequently used mind gets sharper. By noon, Scott had exhausted his list of questions and was given an hour's break. He retreated from the portrait's room and ate a sandwich in the outer study. Remember to keep it clean, Helena called loudly from the painting. She had very strong opinions about eating in the study. Hey, I've never made this study dirty, Scott protested, incredulous. He suspected Helena was simply jealous he could eat. Of course, I'm just reminding you, she snapped, though she was still sitting in the indoor painting, spoon idly stirring her cup. Scott ignored her and finished his sandwich. "Why are you eating such plain food? It can't taste good," she said. He swallowed and answered dryly, "It's not very good." "I knew it," Helena crowed. Scott only offered another perfunctory nod. After lunch, he picked a book from the shelves. Many of the charms texts were obsolete. The charm systems of 1,000 years ago were different, so he preferred books about the lives and adventures of wizards from that time. He found anecdotes about the ancestors of pure-blood families, and even one author who bragged about dueling an ancestor of the House of Black, describing him with disgust as "that damned crafty old dog." Other books contained odd theories. One author argued that wizards were actually a kind of humanoid magical creature whose magic was instinctive, and that spells and wands had suppressed that instinct. He claimed to have tried to restore it by living naked in the wild, eating raw meat and blood for years. Of course, he failed. The book read like the ramblings of a madman. "Oh, that one is written by a lunatic," Helena said again. "Only good for a laugh, no value at all." "I'm reading it as a joke," Scott said. "It's my relaxation." When the hour ended, he returned the book to the shelf, sat at Helena's desk, and began to organize and digest the knowledge from the morning. Dinner was hurried, and he stayed in the study until just before curfew. Hogwarts had quieted. No one wandered outside the dormitories. The Weasley twins, now busy with inventions and business, rarely indulged in night escapades anymore. Scott used a few secret passages to save time and make his way back to Ravenclaw Tower. The eagle-shaped bronze door knocker asked a straightforward question tonight, not a riddle: how to protect against malevolent ghosts using herbology knowledge. "Wear a wreath woven from blackberries," Scott answered quickly. "Correct answer." The door opened, and Scott strode inside. The common room was dark and nearly empty. The fire in the hearth had almost died. Scott walked straight to the sofa by the fire and sat with his back to the door. "Good evening, Luna." He nudged the girl curled up on the sofa. She blinked awake. "Oh, good evening, Scott." Luna rubbed her eyes. "Eddie said you hadn't come back, so I was waiting." "Is something wrong?" Scott asked, pulling out his wand and casting a flame charm into the fireplace. The flames flared with a small bang. "You missed the Quidditch match. Slytherin beat Hufflepuff," she said, then slid from the sofa to the carpet, squatting by the hearth to set a blackened silver kettle near the fire. "It's about the disappearance of the Thestrals." She spoke in that soft, disjunct tone of hers. "This afternoon, Hagrid told me Professor Dumbledore found some clues in the forest." "Did they find where the Thestral herd went?" Scott asked. Luna shook her head. "They found where the Thestrals disappeared, on the edge of the Forbidden Forest. Hagrid said there were traces of blood and charms." "Blood used to lure them?" Scott murmured. Luna nodded. "Dumbledore's conclusion, as Hagrid told me, is that the Thestrals were lured there with blood and then controlled by a powerful Confundus charm to fly away." "The Ministry should be involved," Scott said. "Thestrals are dangerous magical creatures, and whoever took them is likely a dark wizard who traffics in magical beasts." "You're right." Luna lifted the kettle and poured hot water into 2 cups, handing one to Scott. "Hagrid said Dumbledore has already told the Ministry." Scott took the cup, hot cocoa, and sipped. "I really hope the Ministry can find them. My dad says the Ministry never gets anything done." Luna settled back on the sofa, voice a little shaky. "I wrote to my dad. He's going to put it in the next issue of the Quibbler and appeal to readers for help finding the Thestrals." "That could help," Scott said. Luna looked worried. "Hagrid's heartbroken. Last school year, he lost another good friend and its family, and now Ooh and its herd are gone too." Scott felt a prick of awkwardness at that. Hagrid's other good friend was Aragog, the acromantula that once lived in the Forbidden Forest. Aragog, Mozag, and all their offspring, creatures Scott himself had slain the previous year. Only a few people at Hogwarts knew the truth. He kept his face turned to the fire. Luna was staring into the flames and hadn't noticed. "Perhaps they could ask Professor Trelawney to try divination," Scott suggested after a moment. "With so few known variables, I can't calculate it with arithmancy." Luna turned to him. "Some say Professor Trelawney is very accurate. Others call her a fraud. There must be a reason she's taught at Hogwarts so long," Scott said with a small smile. "I'll tell Hagrid your idea tomorrow." "I'll try to take Professor Trelawney's class next year," Luna said eagerly. "Give it a go. You might have a talent for divination. Scott checked his pocket watch. You should go to bed, Luna. All right. She drank her cocoa in one long swallow, set the cup on the table, waved, and tiptoed up the stairs to her dormitory. Good night. Good night. Scott replied and climbed to the boys' dormitory as well. Please give me monthly votes, recommendation votes. Completed 9,000 words again today, asking for votes. 294. Big news on Monday. Oh, Merlin. Big news. This is undoubtedly big news. Merlin's beard. On Monday morning, the great hall was unusually noisy at breakfast as a flock of male owls swooped over the long tables, scattering letters and feathers. Every student who had a copy of the Daily Prophet stared wide-eyed at the headline on the front page. Gasps of shock rose and fell. Look, Eddie spread the newspaper flat across the Ravenclaw table. Oh my goodness, Edinburgh Castle has been occupied. Scott pushed back his chair and leaned over. Miss Slytherin reappears, conquers Edinburgh Castle, he read aloud, skimming the article. Then he looked across at Luna, who was sitting opposite. Maybe Hogwarts's thestral herd has been found, he suggested. Oh, I'm afraid so, Luna said, leaning on the table and studying the paper. She began to read aloud. On the evening of November 7th, Miss Slytherin descended from the sky in a self-propelled flying carriage, surrounded by a group of masked figures in green robes. That was last night. Unbelievable, Eddie said. Edinburgh is Muggle territory. Roger frowned. That means a lot of Muggles must have seen magic, Luna continued. But a wizard living near Edinburgh claims the magnificent carriage was actually drawn by 4 thestrals, and her green-robed guards were also mounted on thestrals. Oh, Luna looked up at Scott. Maybe it's Uwu and his herd. She's taken them. If those really are Hogwarts's thestrals, that's dangerously reckless, Roger said. They put a charm on the castle to drive away the Muggles. They didn't kill anyone. Well, I suppose I shouldn't be glad about that, but the statute of secrecy was broken, Eddie said, a little guilty. Why would that woman occupy Edinburgh Castle? Roger asked, perplexed. It's a Muggle castle. There's no magic there. Scott smiled. Who knows? Maybe the Muggles never discovered the magic that's been hidden in the castle all this time. Edinburgh Castle was built in the 6th century, actually centuries before Hogwarts, Milton added, surprised as he read on. Muggles think it's the oldest castle in Europe, and this article says wizards serving the old king may have helped build it. Merlin, shouldn't we be worrying about the statute of secrecy being broken? Kyla, who'd been listening, said loudly. Exactly, her boyfriend Dylan agreed. Oh, don't worry, Scott said, turning to the group. The Ministry of Magic is handling it. Eddie nodded. There were Aurors, and the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, Accidental Magic Reversal Squads, Obliviators, and the Muggle-Worthy Excuse Committee. They were busy all night. Scott added, they wiped the memories of witnesses, put a Muggle-repelling charm around the castle, and the Muggle government will say it's closed for repairs. At that moment, Dumbledore and the professors entered the Great Hall. The noise dropped as students fell silent and the teachers took their seats. Scott and his friends sat back down. Milton, still worried, said, No one knows what Miss Slytherin intends to do. Eddie whispered, Do you think she'll drain the castle's magic like she did at the Merlin Order, or will she take it over entirely? At the staff table, Professor McGonagall tapped her cup with her wand. Quiet, please, she said in the strict voice that always commanded silence. Good morning. When the hall was still, Dumbledore rose. I believe you are all aware of today's news, so I will be brief. His gaze swept the students. For the safety of the students, Hogsmeade weekends are canceled starting this week. The Great Hall erupted. The Weasley twins were among those loudly protesting. Scott heard Fred shout, Is it not customary to give prisoners a bit of time outdoors? Everyone, quiet. Percy stood up to scold them, face flushed. Dumbledore, smiling but stern, continued, You will remain in the castle until the Christmas holidays. He glanced at the twins. Mr. Filch will be instructed to guard the secret passages. Oh, damn, Eddie muttered to Scott. Our proxy shopping business. Scott shrugged. Cancel it for now. He didn't mention that the twins knew several secret passages Filch didn't. After breakfast, Luna said to Scott, Hagrid wasn't in the hall. We ought to go see him. At noon, Scott said. He wanted to confirm whether the thestrals mentioned in the paper were indeed the Hogwarts herd. When morning classes ended, they ate quickly and walked to Hagrid's hut on the edge of the forbidden forest. "Oh, it's you." Hagrid opened the door, his eyes red. "Come in. Harry and the others are here too." Inside, Harry, Ron, and Hermione were gathered around the large round table. After greeting one another, Scott and Luna sat down. "Are you all right, Hagrid?" Luna asked. "We read the paper and think the Thestrals in Edinburgh might be Oo and his herd." "They're them," Hagrid blurted. He shuffled to the table and sat, the stool creaking. He pulled a filthy, tablecloth-sized handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed at his eyes. "I went this morning. I went to Edinburgh. Couldn't get near the castle, but I saw them flying above it. I was on Sirius's motorbike." His words tumbled out, loud and broken. "I saw Oo and the others." Harry, Ron, and Hermione looked puzzled. It was obvious they hadn't heard yet about the missing Thestrals. Hagrid went on, choked up. "Oo, he was the first foal born in the forest. He became the leader. I only ever had one stallion and 5 mares at first. Oh, I can't save them. The bleeding thieves." Hermione gestured toward a letter on the table. "What's going on, Hagrid? Are these the Thestrals the paper mentioned? I thought you were already dealing with a lawsuit." "I haven't time for a lawsuit," Hagrid snapped, agitated. "Lucius Malfoy can sue me if he wants. I'm worried about Oo and the herd." He began to cry again, covering his face with the dirt-streaked handkerchief. "They've lost their freedom. Those bastards put saddles, halters, and reins on them." Harry suddenly asked, "So, what are Thestrals?" Scott noticed that Harry and Ron looked even more bewildered than before. Hermione turned on them, incredulous, took a deep breath, and was about to launch into an explanation when Scott held up a hand. "Wait, it's getting messy. Let's be clear about what each of us knows." He looked at Luna. "Hermione, you tell us about this Wizengamot notice first, then Luna can explain Thestrals." Hermione nodded and began to explain the letter from the Wizengamot that lay on the table. 295. Looking for a breakthrough, After Hermione and Luna finished talking, Scott and Harry finally sorted out the immediate matters. Scott wasn't particularly worried about the lawsuit. Lucius Malfoy had been furious about Dumbledore and the board's previous decisions and had resorted to legal action. He was using his ministry connections to influence the Wizengamot and hoped to punish Hagrid and to have the hippogriff that injured his son condemned. Scott didn't think it would be fatal for Hagrid as long as Dumbledore was willing to help. And if the hippogriff were to face death, that could be dealt with the way it had been in the original story, if Harry and his friends chose to use Hermione's time turner. That wasn't Scott's main concern. What worried Scott far more was Medea. He still had only one confirmed fact from Hagrid. The Thestral herd had been stolen from Hogwarts by people connected to Medea. He couldn't risk sending Lambo and the Ravens to Edinburgh. Lambo had already been caught by Medea once while shadowing Katie Shafiq and had been confounded, flying home on autopilot. In the hut, Hagrid's grief about the Thestrals dominated everything. He kept sniffling and wiping his eyes and refused to listen to most practical suggestions. Harry and Ron offered a string of ideas that Hermione knocked down one by one. Scott and Luna said nothing, just watched the 3 Gryffindors spar like spectators at a lively performance. By lunchtime, they hadn't arrived at anything useful. Walking back to the castle, Hermione declared, "I'll look for precedents in the library. Maybe there are similar cases we can use. You two should come with me." Harry and Ron made long faces. Hermione sniffed irritably. "You're not planning to leave Hagrid to deal with this alone, are you?" "Of course not," Harry said quickly. Ron nodded, reluctantly. Hermione brightened and marched on. Harry turned to Scott and Luna. "Do you have any ideas?" he asked. Scott glanced at him, unimpressed by the transparent attempt to pass responsibility on to someone else. Ron chimed in, hopeful. "You're clever, Scott. Fred and George said so. Surely you know something?" Luna suddenly burst into a quiet, slightly hysterical laugh at the scene. The others looked at her, puzzled. Even Hermione turned in surprise. After a long breath, Luna stopped laughing and said, wavering, "Oh, don't worry. Hagrid will be all right." The 3 Gryffindors weren't sure what to make of that. "Sorry," Luna added, apologetic. "I don't know anything about legal proceedings." Scott then answered Harry and Ron. "I can write and ask William," he said. "William?" Hermione stopped in her tracks. "Who's that?" "A Ravenclaw who graduated last year. Scott explained. "He's very interested in law and wants to become a barrister. If he's willing to take Hagrid's case, it would make things a lot easier." Harry and Ron brightened at that. "Great," Harry said. "We'll pay him." Scott added a disclaimer. "I don't know if William will agree to be Hagrid's defense, and if he does, he'll expect compensation." That night, Scott reflected on William. He had been under the impression that William had left the magical world to take Muggle University entrance exams. He wasn't sure whether William was actually gone for good, or whether he had been one of those quietly drawn into Medea's orbit. It's hard for a wizard to vanish completely back into Muggle life. The habits and ties of magic don't unmake so easily, even for someone from a Muggle family. When they'd said goodbye at the end of the school year, Scott had tried not to pry and had wished William luck. But the farewell had felt oddly definitive, and Scott, projecting a bit of himself, couldn't help suspecting there was more to it. He needed information about Medea and had few safe avenues. He didn't want to contact Medea directly, and Lambo's recent mishap made Raven reconnoitering risky. Using Hagrid's lawsuit as a reason to reopen contact with William felt like a reasonable, low-risk way to probe. After classes that afternoon, Scott went to the owlery with a written note. He hired a nimble courier owl with some extra food and sent it off, then released a small flock of ravens to follow at a discreet distance. "I hope he hasn't put charms on himself to block post," Scott muttered as he handed the ravens their portion. Wizards who wanted to be unreachable could do it, blocking owls and sealing off magical contact, but he hoped William hadn't done so. Satisfied, Scott left the owlery and went on to his evening Transfiguration Club. The club was for students with stronger talent in Transfiguration, and thus they were already working ahead of the ordinary syllabus. Scott and the other fifth years had been introduced to human transfiguration, an advanced, dangerous branch that culminates in becoming an animagus. Normally, this knowledge isn't part of the ordinary wizarding levels. Only sixth-year students pursuing advanced transfiguration would encounter it. But Professor McGonagall assumed these club members would continue transfiguration next year, so she began covering some of the material now. Scott had chosen to study human transfiguration with the intention of attempting the animagus transformation in his sixth year. McGonagall was appreciative of his caution and warned them repeatedly that human transfiguration was perilous. "If you don't want a trip to the hospital wing, do your experiments under my supervision, even if you're only trying to enlarge an ear," she told them more than once. Scott took her seriously. He didn't want to end up as a cautionary tale. Others were less careful. Angelina had tried privately to enlarge her hand to catch the quaffle better and had wound up in the hospital wing. Scott had learned to think that Quidditch was not worth the risk. The next morning, there was a reply. William hadn't completely abandoned the magical world after all. He wrote that although he was currently attending school to prepare for university entrance, he'd be glad to help as Hagrid's defense counsel. "I didn't expect to receive such a case," William wrote in Scott's letter, "but I'd be honored. In the Muggle world, I'm not yet qualified to be a barrister, of course, but as a Ravenclaw graduate, I think this would be a meaningful experience, perhaps a good way to mark my farewell from the magical community, and certainly more interesting than a graduation dinner. Thank you, Scott." Scott brought the letter to the Gryffindor table and read it aloud. "He agreed," he said. Hermione read the arrangement and frowned. "He suggested meeting this Saturday at the Three Broomsticks, but our Hogsmeade trip was canceled." "Let Hagrid deal with the meeting," Scott said. "I'm just passing him the message." He gave Harry a deliberate wink. He intended to slip out and observe William from a distance, an opportunity to see how his old classmate was doing and perhaps glean whether he'd been influenced by Medea. Harry's eyes lit up. "Let's tell Hagrid right away," he said, heading off with Hermione to share the news. After Scott and Harry finished talking and were about to head back to the Ravenclaw table, Neville came over and handed Scott a glass jar. "Scott, this is your yarrow tea," he said. "Oh, it's ready?" Scott took the jar gladly, opened it, and inhaled. "Even just the smell is refreshing," he said with a smile. "Thanks, Neville." Neville gave a shy little smile. "Professor Sprout helped me. Yarrow tea for divination is tricky to make, so it took a while." "Thank you so much." Scott patted Neville on the shoulder. "If you ever need arithmancy help, come to me on the house." Neville nodded, genuinely pleased. After morning classes, Lambo, who hadn't been seen for a while, flew out of the forbidden forest and landed on Scott's shoulder as he was about to nap in his dormitory. Scott brought him to an empty classroom, cast a soundproofing charm, and settled down to talk. "Long time no see," Scott said, stroking Lambo's wings. "How's Oak Cottage?" "Long time no see, Scott." Lambo rubbed Scott's hand with his beak. "Oak Cottage is thriving under my care." "Thanks," Scott said. Lambo looked pleased with himself. "I came because one of the crows you sent out yesterday came back." "Oh?" Scott raised an eyebrow. "What did it bring back?" "The crows followed the owl to London," Lambo said. "That crow told me that the gentleman lit a small fireplace right after he received your letter. A toy fireplace, really a localized flue connection." Scott let out a soft exhale. "So William hasn't given up magic after all." "Of course not. Who would give up magic?" Lambo said, matter of fact. They spent the next period swapping news. Lambo reported that the three families contesting Travers's inheritance had recently gone quiet after a stretch of fierce but non-lethal infighting. Because no one had been killed, Lambo hadn't thought it urgent to tell Scott before. The calm before the storm? Scott guessed. He'd been overhearing a lot at the Slytherin table lately, and Millicent Bulstrode, who'd missed the welcome feast, was still absent. Scott suspected her family might be deep in that fight, and worried even Hogwarts wasn't safe for her. When they'd finished trading information, Scott lowered his voice. "Start having the crows watch the three broomsticks from today, and this Saturday, you're coming with me." Lambo hesitated. "I can come, but are you sure you want to go? What if Medea shows up?" "You said she needs you to use arithmancy to calculate the Dark Lord's Horcrux," Lambo said worriedly. "Medea won't appear," Scott said with too much confidence. "If she did, that," he glanced at the little card he'd received from William, "would be useless to me." "As long as it's useful this time," Lambo grumbled, then pecked Scott's finger with a bit of force. "How did you get so stupid, Scott?" Scott blinked. "I got stupid?" "You're not quite right," Lambo said, and pecked him again, harder this time so that Scott felt real pain. "You said you wouldn't take risks after the Isle of Man last summer." The reminder hit him. Scott frowned. He had been careless, uncharacteristically so. Even now, despite his nagging doubt, the belief that Medea would not appear had lodged itself in his head as if by habit. Why? He should have been suspicious. Lambo had already told him William had a little fireplace. Suddenly, Scott felt very awkward. "What's wrong with me?" He drew his wand and touched its tip to his temple. Finite incantatum. A golden flash, and Scott felt certain thoughts modify themselves, subtle but definite. He began to question his earlier certainty. Why had he been so sure Medea would stay away? He'd always thought that if Medea appeared, the William card would be useless to him. But thinking it over now, the opposite seemed possible. What if the card was meant to be used precisely to draw him out of Hogwarts? He could always leave with a portkey, except the portkey was a gift from Medea. A portkey might be handy against others, but not necessarily against Medea. Scott's face grew grim. From the moment he'd received the letter, why had he been inclined to meet William, even to the point of brushing off danger? He fished the letter out of his enchanted lizard skin satchel and reread it. This time, nothing in him stirred toward the appointment. He smelled the paper, a faint herbal scent. And now, with his senses cleared, he picked up the faint, residual magic on the letter, so subtle he'd missed it before. Someone had deliberately enchanted that letter to influence him. He stared at the scrap of parchment in disbelief. He, with his magic perception, had been deceived. What kind of charm could fool him so instantly? "That's outrageous," he muttered. He had written to William thinking he was trying his luck, trying to fish for information, and instead someone else had been fishing for him. "Scott! Scott!" Lambo's voice brought him back. "You all right?" Lambo asked, worried. "You look pale." Scott cupped the bird in his hands. "Good thing you were here," he said, still shaking. Lambo preened and looked smug. "You're my best friend." Scott paced the classroom. "No," he said, jaw tight. "I have to figure out what method they used. If I don't, I could be taken in again." His wild guesses wouldn't get him far. He needed help, and the best course of action, of course, was to consult the Ravenclaw mentor. Chapter 2 and 97, Ravenclaw tutor explains, "Were you hit with the Imperius?" Lambeau asked Scott anxiously. "What are you going to do?" Hearing Lambeau's concern calmed Scott a little. He answered the increasingly humanized Raven, "Medea used the Confundus charm on you last time, but what hit me this time wasn't the Imperius, it was a Moor." He hesitated, then found a better word. A subtler, almost imperceptible magic, and he waved the letter in his hand. "There's still a scent on it. That means this magic works together with some potion or herb." Lambeau tilted his head. "That sounds scary. I don't understand any of that." Scott smiled, feeling a little lighter. He checked his pocket watch. It was still half an hour before afternoon classes. "Let's split up for now," he said, opening the classroom window. "Find me after classes." "No problem." Lambeau flew out. Scott knelt, touched his wand tip to the floor, and murmured, "Finite incantatem." A golden light flowed from his wand, undoing the silencing charm he had placed. Then he rose and hurried up to the 8th floor to Helena's study. "Scott?" Helena in the portrait looked surprised at his sudden entrance. "Why are you here? Today isn't the weekend." "I ran into something," Scott said. "Please open the door, Helena. I need to see the Ravenclaw mentor." "Very well." Seeing Scott's serious expression, Helena didn't argue and opened the door for him. He thanked her and stepped into the inner room where the Ravenclaw portrait presided. "Mentor," he said, bowing politely. The Ravenclaw portrait looked at him with steady, wise eyes. "What's happened, Scott?" she asked. Scott explained the situation concisely. The Ravenclaw portrait listened without commenting on Medea or on Scott's personal ties to her. She simply glanced at the letter in his hand and then explained why he had been affected. "You weren't practicing occlumency," she said. "No," Scott admitted. "I don't keep it up all the time." "Then remember to take precautions next time you receive a dangerous letter." The portrait offered a mild smile. "The method they used is very simple. Try wetting the letter." Scott raised his wand and produced a drizzle of water, soaking the paper. Much of the writing blurred, but some strokes remained sharp. "Do you see it?" the portrait asked. "This is." Scott had already noticed that the remaining strokes made a discontinuous pattern. He'd assumed William's handwriting was messy. Now it made sense. "A simple rune circuit," the Ravenclaw portrait said softly. "It works much like an enthrallment charm. Those strokes were probably mixed with a confounding potion." "So that's it." Scott smiled helplessly. The confounding potion had clouded his perception just long enough for the rune circuit to activate. The potion only needed to disorient him for an instant. The rune did the rest. The method was not complicated, just easy to fall for unknowingly. Now that he knew, the attack felt preventable. He just had to be more careful. He sniffed the damp paper. The herbal scent was stronger. "This smell, it's familiar." He leaned closer and inhaled again. Suddenly, a name occurred to him. "Miss Grapeland," he murmured. "It smells a bit like the sage the assistant smokes." "Confounding potions made primarily from sage are not uncommon," the Ravenclaw portrait said. "When sage is burned, inhaling the smoke can act like a non-addictive hallucinogen." So there might not be a direct connection between the two, Scott thought, though he felt a little uneasy. Perhaps he should keep an eye on Miss Grapeland for a while. He checked the time, 10 minutes until class. He thanked the mentor and bowed. "Consider whether what you intend to do is more important than your studies," the Ravenclaw portrait warned. "If it isn't worth the time." "I understand, mentor." Scott bowed again, took his leave of Helena, and hurried away. He reached the History of Magic classroom's Professor Binns, Hogwarts' ghostly lecturer, began his leisurely roll call. After the afternoon classes, Lambeau returned and settled on Scott's shoulder. Since other students were around, the Raven stayed quiet. "Why do you have a second Raven?" Roger asked, and Milton peered with curiosity. "Did you transfigure him?" "Of course." Scott stroked Lambeau's feathers. "I'm practicing." He ended the sentence when Lambeau snapped at his finger with a sharp peck. In Lambeau's memory, he wasn't a transfiguration, just a talented Raven. Scott laughed it off. "I'm practicing making him more responsive," he said. Lambeau pecked him again, but didn't betray Scott's little fib. A hushed voice called, "Hey, Scott!" He looked toward the corridor and saw Harry crouched behind a pillar, waving him over. Scott remembered the hint he'd given Harry the day before, when he told Hermione he wouldn't meet William. Harry must be checking on the Saturday meeting. Scott motioned to his roommates to head to the Great Hall first and slipped off to meet Harry alone. "Who are you hiding from?" he asked with a smile. "I don't want Hermione to see me," Harry said, a little embarrassed, scratching his head. He beckoned Scott into the corner. Ron was crouched there, peeking out. "Since term started, Hermione's been really elusive," Harry whispered. "Ron and I keep running into her a lot." Ron scowled. "I think she knows some secret passages and isn't telling us." "I don't think so. She always looks exhausted. She must have another secret," Harry added. Scott understood. Hermione was using a time turner, but he didn't want to listen to their speculation. He asked instead, "Do you need something from me?" "Oh, right." Harry remembered what he'd meant to say. "I told Hagrid. He'll meet William at the Three Broomsticks on Saturday, but I didn't tell Hagrid that we'd be going too." "We're going too?" Scott pretended surprise. "Aren't we?" Harry looked taken aback. "You hinted at me when you were talking to Hermione," he protested. Ron added, "I saw you do it." Scott acted even more surprised. "Why would you think that? I was only hinting to Harry to speak on my behalf. I didn't want Hermione to give me a lecture on discipline." Harry gaped. "Oh, I thought you had a way to sneak out." "Of course not," Scott said, smiling. "Dumbledore warned that Filch watches the secret passages." "Is that so?" Harry looked disappointed, and Ron's face fell in sympathy. They looked like two children whose outing had been canceled. "Even if we went, we wouldn't be much help," Scott said. "Let Hagrid handle the meeting. Don't worry, William's a professional." He led them back toward the Great Hall. "Now, dinner." Scott didn't feel guilty. He knew Harry was one of Voldemort's Horcruxes, and with Medea hunting for the remaining pieces, it was safer for Harry to stay out of her sight. He'd be more careful from now on. The second weekend of November arrived. Scott was in the room of requirement early on Saturday morning, ready for a day of intense study. Even during lunch, he kept working, conducting transfiguration experiments in Helena's study. He sat cross-legged on the carpet with a monitoring bat fluttering ahead of him. Then, decisively, he raised his wand and cast a color-changing charm. Color-changing! The beam struck the bat cleanly, but the next instant there was a cracking sound. Crack, crack, crack. The noise of wood splitting echoed through the room. The bat didn't change color. Its wings froze, it reverted to a wooden carving, and then shattered into splinters across the floor. Helena, sitting in a portrait nearby and watching him, couldn't help speaking. "What are you doing?" she asked, more annoyed than alarmed. "Who told you could wreck my study?" "My apologies." Scott sat up, brushed himself off, and flicked his wand. The wood chips vanished from the carpet. He reached into his morphing lizard skin bag and drew out a wooden bat carving, already inscribed with ancient runes. This time he transfigured it into a live bat instead of relying on a charm. He didn't cast anything else. He rested his chin on his hand and thought for a long moment. "What exactly are you doing?" Helena asked again. Scott looked up. "I'm doing transfiguration experiments," he said. He held out a finger and the bat landed lightly there. "This is a monitoring bat," he explained quietly. "I first carved a monitoring rune on the wooden figure so the bat can transmit sounds it hears over long distances into my ears." Helena's surprise was audible. "You cast transfiguration on an object inscribed with runes? That's unheard of. No wonder Mother chose you as an apprentice." Scott said nothing. He just watched the bat. Helena kept talking. "Charms impose certain states on objects. Transfiguration is, in a way, another state. Different states affect one another. If the charms do similar things, maybe it's manageable," Scott said, "but the runes are a different system from charms altogether." Helena's voice grew animated. "On that bat, logically, the runes' operations and the transfiguration's maintenance should be very difficult to reconcile. And yet you did it." "I did. That part isn't too hard," Scott admitted. "Even casting charms on purely transfigured products is workable. But the difficult part is," he tightened his grip on his wand, "how to make all three coexist." "Three?" Helena cried. Scott nodded casually. "Transfiguration, charms, and runes all at once?" she almost shouted. "You're mad." "No." Scott made the bat fly up and raised his wand again. "Color changing." Crack, crack, crack. He watched without expression as the wooden carving exploded into splinters and fell. Helena spoke in a flat, matter-of-fact tone. What you're trying to do is force an object to maintain three different forms simultaneously through magic. The inevitable result of that is collapse. Scott cast a scouring charm to clear the mess. The superposition of all three is indeed almost impossible, he agreed. It's absolutely impossible, Helena insisted. You thought the superposition of two was absolutely impossible once, too, Scott said with a small smile. That, Helena faltered, briefly at a loss for words. But maintaining the stability of three states at once is infinitely harder than two. Indeed. Scott nodded, as if it were obvious. That's why I'm learning. I'm trying. I believe one day I'll solve it. Helena fell quiet after that, staring at him with a thoughtful expression. What's the difference between you and me? She said softly. Different ways of thinking. I set an upper limit for my magic with my concepts. You don't. Scott blinked in surprise. What a pity, she continued with a small, rueful sigh. I understand now, but I can no longer try and experience it. He wanted to tell her that belief alone isn't enough, that wizards also have talent and limits, but he kept the thought to himself. Perhaps Helena already understood that. She'd only been trying to amuse herself anyway. He let her keep the indulgence. Lunch ended, and Scott made his way into the inner room where the Ravenclaw portrait hung. Mentor, he began, but his morphing bag at his waist began to vibrate wildly. He yanked it free and called out, It's Medea. Ravenclaw smiled from her frame. Is that the localized flu network you mentioned? She peered at the trembling bag and gestured for him to open it. He loosened his hold, and the bag unlatched itself. A small toy fireplace popped out and hovered above his palm. Green flames licked within it. Scott couldn't help the wry thought. Trollope, king of the hearth? Good afternoon, Scott, Medea's voice issued from the green fire. Good afternoon, Medea, Scott said, setting the tiny hearth on his hand. You really didn't go to see William, Medea said. And I don't think his presumptuous little stunt could have actually made you leave Hogwarts. I fell for it, Scott admitted with a rueful smile, but luckily a friend noticed something was off and warned me in time. Medea's smile softened. I didn't stop William, she said. I tacitly approved of it. Scott's eyebrows rose. But you didn't think it would succeed? Of course not. Medea kept smiling. If such a small thing could have worked, boy, I would have been very disappointed in you. Was it a test? Scott asked. No. Medea shook her head. I just didn't see any reason to stop William. You two seem to have a good relationship. Scott's mouth twitched. Good relationship, he thought. What a way to describe William's playful antics. He felt a faint flush of embarrassment. Truth was, he'd nodded off. Typing on his phone in bed in the small hours had made him drop off, and that's why he'd been vulnerable to the prank. You haven't contacted me, Scott. Medea's voice rose from the small green flame in his palm, cool and casual. It seems you're still unwilling to help me locate Tom's Horcrux. Scott glanced up at the Ravenclaw portrait. She had been listening with obvious interest. When he looked at her, she only gave a slight smile and a barely perceptible nod to keep him talking. As I said, Scott told the tiny fireplace, you overestimate me. I don't have that ability. A soft, amused chuckle fluttered from the flame. This time, Medea did not sound angry at all. You know, boy, I don't necessarily need to sacrifice Tom's soul to be reborn. Even framed as a laugh, the words carried a chill. Scott thought of Gilderoy Lockhart and Brandon Yaxley, men whose magic and life force had been drained in Medea's rituals, their bodies melted away like candles. So, when you attacked the Merlin Order's stronghold, and when you occupied Edinburgh Castle, those were meant to tap the vast magic stored in those ancient sites and sacrifice wizards' lives? He asked. Yes, Medea said, smiling. Sacrificing wizards is one way to accelerate my recovery. It's just that the number required is considerable. Scott looked back at the portrait. Ravenclaw sat composed and unbothered in her frame, that same patient smile on her face. He recalled what she'd said when she formally accepted him as her apprentice. I will not restrict your actions, as long as you are not utterly evil. Nor do I demand your morality, as long as you are not completely depraved. On the path of exploring magic, I hope you will always be wise, always steadfast, and never stop advancing. If Medea were truly planning mass sacrifices for power, she would fit Ravenclaw's definition of utterly evil. But Scott could not see himself as utterly evil for failing to stop her. He forced a smile. Are you threatening me, Miss Slytherin, with the lives of strangers? Who can say? Medea answered flatly. Perhaps my subordinates will happen to capture a wizard you know. I still can't help you. Arithmancy isn't omnipotent, especially not at my level. Scott's confusion edged into his voice. It's puzzling. Why are you so sure I can do it? The flame flickered, and Medea explained. I've sought diviners of genuine talent all across Europe. They foretold the locations of Horcruxes for me. She paused, then chuckled softly. And their results all pointed to you, boy. Scott's expression tightened. He felt like swearing. He opened his mouth, then clung to a tone of incredulousness. Are you sure those diviners really had true talent? Of course. I tested them, Medea replied calmly. Scott persisted, more earnestly now. I even tried privately with arithmancy. I couldn't. There aren't enough known conditions to work with. If he had only used arithmancy, he was right. He couldn't divine it. What Medea did not know was that he already knew the answer by other means. Medea was quiet for a moment, uncertain whether to believe him. Fine, I can wait, she said at last. When you have a clue regarding Tom's Horcrux, remember to tell me. I don't think I can find anything, Scott said. He emphasized what he was, just a student. Who knows? Maybe Tom hid other Horcruxes at Hogwarts like Ravenclaw's diadem, Medea mused. Not likely. Scott answered quickly. If that were true, Headmaster Dumbledore would have found them long ago. He has the most authority in this castle. He tried to deflect. You should question the Death Eaters and search their homes. The diary, for example, was hidden in the Malfoy household. That's what I'm doing, Medea said. Scott was surprised. You've already searched multiple houses? No wonder he hadn't heard. Death Eaters are purebloods who would never publicize anything shameful. They'd hide it. Or, as Scott had feared before, perhaps former Death Eaters now wore green robes. All right, I hope you make the right choice, boy, Medea said impatiently. If I can't find Tom's Horcruxes, I'll choose a wicked method to restore myself, and I will make it known. Was that moral blackmail? Scott frowned, refusing to be intimidated. I'm not a savior, nor a righteous companion. I'm only an apprentice. A soft, almost wistful chuckle came from the flame. Scott, how I wish you were a Gryffindor, she said. Hufflepuff would do too. Scott noticed the sudden shift. The threat had been an act. I prefer Ravenclaw, he replied. Ravenclaw in the portrait gave him another faint smile. All right, no need to be so tense, boy. Medea's tone lightened into nonchalance. Talking to you helped pass the time. Goodbye. Scott's eyes narrowed. Oh, by the way, William's little fireplace number is 0119, and he already has your number. I hope your friendship lasts. Medea said one more thing, then cut the connection. The green flame winked out. Scott stared at the cold hearth for a moment before he felt himself come back to the present. Are you rather puzzled? Ravenclaw's voice asked from the painting. Scott turned. There was a new edge in Ravenclaw's gaze now, a sharpness that seemed to cut through pretense. You must find Medea's unpredictability unsettling, she said. That is precisely her aim. 300. Ravenclaw tutors satisfaction. I've never understood Medea's aim, Scott said, frowning. During the contract challenge, she had 2 wizards ambush me in the Forbidden Forest. They tried to kill me. He began pacing. And yet, when she left Hogwarts, she gave me a gift. I have to admit, it was precious. He glanced up at the Ravenclaw portrait. The woman in the frame smiled. Go on, she prompted. She wants to win you over, then? Because she thinks you have a good future? Scott's frown deepened. She isn't openly aggressive, but she's always got those calculating little tricks. He stopped and met the painting's steady gaze. I've handled them so far. You've handled them all, the Ravenclaw portrait said. Scott nodded. He had, for now, seen off Medea's machinations, but he couldn't be sure what the future held. Even the best can make mistakes, and Scott always felt a trap might spring at any time. Medea's presence kept him on edge in a way he didn't like. The portrait's next words touched that nerve. She does see a good future for you, the portrait said, meaningfully, but trying to tame an eagle that yearns for freedom is not an easy task. Scott's expression changed. The portrait's words made him think of something he'd seen online in his previous life. Aoing, or odying, an old Beijing term for training falcons. Because eagles are fierce and untamable, the method involved capturing them and depriving them of sleep for days until their wildness wore down. The image fit. Medea wasn't out to hurt him so much as to keep him constantly on guard, distracted, exhausted, always slightly off balance. The techniques a trainer uses on a wild beast, the portrait suggested, are not so different when the target is a person. Scott understood then. Medea's pressure would likely escalate until one day he couldn't resist. If she believed in his potential enough to invest so much energy into shaping him, then she truly saw something in him. The thought made him want to laugh. Who am I to deserve this? But he kept his composure. You've been thinking this through, the portrait said. Do you know what to do? I do, mentor. Scott's voice was steady. He couldn't focus too much on Medea's petty maneuvers. His priority had to be learning and growing. He couldn't let himself be lulled by small victories. If he let his guard down, he could fall into a far worse trap. If he kept his head and kept improving, Medea would likely keep her expectations of him high and avoid drastic measures. It was, he realized, a contest of will. As those who tame eagles cannot afford to sleep, the eagle tames the trainer in return. I decided long ago, I want to be the Freest Wizard, Scott said, meeting the portrait's eyes. His tone left no room for doubt. No one will ever tame me. A genuine smile spread across the portrait's face. I'm sorry to say that as your mentor, I lack the means to help you with that, she said calmly, and even if I had the means, I would not. Scott had expected such a response. He smiled back. Sometimes the mother eagle breaks her fledglings' wings and pushes them off a cliff, he said. He was thinking of the old legend. The cruel-sounding act of a mother breaking most of a fledgling's wing bones is said to be what makes the wings stronger. The bones heal, the bird struggles to flap, the wings fill with blood and knit back tougher than before, and the fledgling learns to soar. Whether the tale was true or merely inspirational didn't matter. It was the image Scott wanted. Pain, endurance, and freedom earned. The Ravenclaw in the painting sat more formally in her high-backed chair, the bronzed spread eagle motifs on the shoulder of the carving seeming to watch them both. Interesting, she said, amused. I find myself increasingly satisfied with you as an apprentice, Scott. Your instruction is already more than I need, Scott said, bowing slightly. The portrait merely nodded and fell silent. Scott steadied himself, then moved into study. He took out the blueprints Bill had sent with the letter and began walking through the puzzling parts with the portrait. The artifacts, magical creations from ancient Egypt, were fascinating and valuable references. Their script wasn't runes, nor any system Scott knew. It was a hieroglyphic script called the Divine Script, which later evolved into Coptic. Ravenclaw was intrigued as well. Ancient Egyptian magic isn't the same as our old British traditions, she observed. Their use of the Divine Script doesn't align with rune theory, and their alchemy rests on different principles. Regrettably, I studied this little when I lived. As a portrait, she retained Ravenclaw's comprehensive knowledge at the time of her death, and she could gain new memories and learn slowly, but she could not master new disciplines as quickly or fully as the living Ravenclaw had. That limited experience made her commentary cautious. Scott explained another characteristic Bill had noted. Some Egyptian artifacts appeared to have a natural, unforced quality, as if they had not been made at all, but had simply come into being. That notion intrigued Scott because it overlapped with his own vision of ultimate transfiguration. How could something be crafted with the appearance of having never been crafted? Bill had studied the objects and written essays. He hadn't cracked it. Ravenclaw hadn't either. How did they do it? Scott asked out loud, not because he expected the portrait to solve it, but because the question needed to be voiced. There was no answer ready. All Scott could do was keep studying the blueprints, examining every line and notation in hope of an insight. For now, the drawings yielded nothing, but he kept them close. He would return to them again and again, searching for the inspiration that might one day let him fly.